Rome raises the largest army it has ever put in one place. 8 legions, 80,000 men. It marches them onto flat open ground, which is exactly where Hannibal wants them. 216 BC. Puglia. 2 new consuls take an army south, and only one of them is afraid of the plain. This is Roman Knights. We go back. We listen. We stay a while. The winter before, when there were still 2 commanders and 1 war. Paullus has read the ground. Varro has read the crowd. They share command on alternate days. Chapter 1. The first win. The 2 camps sat on the same ridge, 300 yards apart, close enough to hear the other camp's fires at night, close enough that a man on night patrol could see the shapes of the other sentries. Not the faces, the shapes. Fabius had the west position. Minucius had the east. They had divided the army 6 weeks ago and had not spoken more than necessary since. The division had been clean. He had to give Fabius credit for that. He had laid out the map and divided it in half with 2 clear lines. East and west. Half the infantry, half the cavalry, half the supplies. Equal as the assembly had voted. He had not put a thumb on the scale. Minucius had been waiting for the thumb. He had been watching for it. He had not found it. He was not sure what to do with this. Minucius Rufus was 44 years old. He had been a soldier for 22 of those years. He had fought in Spain and in Cisalpine Gaul and in the northern campaigns. He understood the different textures of war. Spain was a war of sharp distances. Cisalpine Gaul was a war of numbers. The Ligurians were something else. Mountain fighters, patient in ways that surprised men who had only fought in open country. He had learned different things in each place. He had learned in Spain that speed was a weapon, that the man who moved faster than his opponent's planning had an advantage that arithmetic could not measure. He had not learned yet the thing underneath speed. The thing underneath was ground. Speed and momentum were responses to what you saw. The ground determined what was real before you saw it. He did not know this yet. He would learn it soon, in the usual way. On the 14th day, a supply column from Geronium moved south of the ridge. Minucius saw it. He called in his cavalry officer and 2 infantry tribunes. He laid out what he intended. The supply column was 40 wagons moving at column pace, without heavy escort. If he moved in the next hour, his cavalry could reach the near road. Before the column's light cavalry could reform, his officers asked 3 questions. He answered 2. The third he set aside as accounting for a possibility that was less likely than the alternative. He moved in the hour. The action near Geronium took 40 minutes. He was proud of the 40 minutes, not the result. The 40 minutes. Speed was skill. You could not fake 40 minutes. You either moved at the right pace or you did not. The count, 20 wagons, 400 prisoners, 40 killed. His own losses 11. 40 minutes, 20 wagons. He stood on the road after and looked at what had been accomplished. The prisoners were already being sorted. The wagons were being inventoried. The cavalry was remounting. Everything was in the correct position. This was what doing it right looked like. The letter from Rome arrived 4 days later. Not an official communication. A personal letter from a senator he knew. His cousin's father-in-law. A man with connections in the tribal assembly and in the corridors of the Basilica Portia. The letter said, "The Geronium action is being discussed. The forum has heard. The contrast is being drawn. Fabius on his hill watching smoke. His master of horse, fighting." The letter said, "You are being discussed in favorable terms." He read it twice. He set it down. He did not smile exactly. He felt the weight of the letter as information. Information about how things were being read in Rome. This was useful. A man who knew how he was being read could make better decisions. He put the letter away. He went outside and looked at the hill to the southeast. The hill had a name. It was not on the military maps. The local names for small hills were not on military maps. He had heard it from a scout. The scout had called it by a Samnite word. He had not kept the word. He had kept the hill. He had been looking at it for 6 weeks. Since the first week on the ridge. The hill was lower than the main position. It had clear sight lines to the plain below. Good approach from the northwest. The approach favored infantry. He had thought about what a strong position on that hill would accomplish. It would give him a forward observation point. It would allow him to threaten Hannibal's movements in the lower valley. It would give his men something to take. He had been waiting for the right moment. The Geronium action was not the right moment, but it was the precedent. It demonstrated that action was possible. That action produced results. That results could come without Fabius's permission. He looked at the hill. He thought, soon. He was sitting outside his tent when Fabius came. Not a runner. Fabius himself. At the 9th hour in the late afternoon light. Walking at his usual pace. The pace that was not slow exactly. The pace of a man who would not be hurried. Minucius stood. This was correct. Sit, Fabius says. He sat. Fabius sat across from him. He did not bring his officers. He had come alone with 2 guards who stopped at the perimeter. He said nothing for a moment. This was a thing about Fabius. He was comfortable in silence. It was not discomfort with silence. It was not patience. It was something else. He seemed to use silence the way other men used the space between words. The Geronium action, Fabius says. Yes. You moved well. Thank you. A pause. There is a hill to the southeast, Fabius says. You have been looking at it. Minucius said nothing. I have been watching you look at it, Fabius says. For 6 weeks. A pause. I walked it, Fabius says. 3 weeks ago, before you arrived on the ridge. Minucius waited. The approach from the northwest is clean, Fabius says. Good ground. Good sight lines. The approach is the part you can see from here. He stopped. There is a draw on the south side. It is not visible from the ridge. From the approach, you cannot see it until you are on the hill itself. Minucius looked at him. The draw runs from the low ground south of the hill to the east slope. A man in the draw is invisible from the hill's north face. He can see the north face from the draw. He cannot be seen from it. A pause. The hill looks like a good position, Fabius says. It is not a good position. The silence settled. Minucius said, I understand. Fabius looked at him. He was looking at the way a man said a thing, not the thing itself. Good, Fabius says. He stood. He walked back toward his camp at the same pace he had come. Not faster, not slower. Minucius watched him go. He thought, he walked the hill 3 weeks ago, before I arrived. He thought, he came to tell me now after the Geronium action. Not before. He sat with this for a while. He looked at the hill to the southeast. He thought about the draw on the south side that could not be seen from the approach. He thought, probably. He thought, probably there is an explanation. South of the ridge, Hannibal had been watching for 3 weeks. Not specifically Minucius. He watched the 2 camps. He watched the patterns. Which camp sent patrols where? Which camp scouts went deep and which stayed close? Which camp moved fast and which moved deliberately? The east camp moved fast. The west camp moved deliberately. He had identified this on the 3rd day. He had confirmed it across 3 weeks of observation. The west camp was Fabius. He had been thinking about Fabius since Trebia. He had been thinking about him since Trasimene. The correct answer to the trap was to not be in the valley when the mist came. Fabius had not been in the valley. Fabius had not been in the valley. He had been on a ridge. He had read the situation correctly from a distance. He had moved the army to the correct position before the action. A man who positioned the army correctly before an action was more dangerous. More so than a man who fought well during it. He had found the draw on the south face of the hill 6 weeks ago. He had positioned the cavalry in the draw 12 days ago. Not actively. In reserve. He had positioned them there because the east camp's pattern indicated that its commander had been looking at the hill. Looking at the hill for 6 weeks meant thinking about the hill. Thinking about the hill meant eventually going to the hill. He had kept the draw prepared. He had also thought about the west camp. If he trapped the east camp's force on the hill, the west camp would respond. The question was how quickly and by what route. He had calculated the routes. The obvious route added 15 minutes. The faster route was not the obvious one. He had thought, the dictator will take the obvious route. He had not thought about this carefully enough. He thought, the hill will come. Not today. When the east camp is ready. When the man who commands it has convinced himself that the reading from the ridge is sufficient. He waited. He had become good at waiting this campaign. It was not natural to him. He was his father's son in some ways, and his father had not been patient. His father had attacked. He had attacked at Trebia and at Trasimene. Waiting required a different kind of attention. Active. Specific. You watched and you updated and you kept the preparation current. He kept the Numidians in the draw. He kept the Spanish infantry in the north tree line. He waited for the east camp to move. The letter arrived from Rome 4 days after the action. It had traveled fast. Faster than official correspondence usually traveled from Rome to a field camp in the southern Apennines. This told him something. Someone in Rome had wanted this letter to arrive quickly. The letter was written in the formal register of official Senate correspondence. It used the correct forms, the correct verbs, the correct address. Between the formal forms it said what it meant. The action near Geronium had demonstrated initiative. The Senate noted the result. The people of Rome were speaking of Minucius Rufus as a commander who acted when action was possible. He read it twice. He set it down. He walked to the eastern edge of the camp. He knew what the letter was. It was not a letter about Geronium. The letter was about the comparison. The Senate had been watching 2 men on a ridge for 6 weeks. One of them had fought. One of them had watched. The letter was the Senate telling him which kind of watching they preferred. He did not feel the satisfaction the letter was designed to produce. He felt a more complicated thing. The satisfaction was in there somewhere. The action had been correct. The execution had been good. The men had performed. 20 wagons. Good result. He allowed himself the satisfaction of the result. The complication was around it. He thought about Fabius's camp 50 yards to the west. He thought about the letter Fabius had received, which his own officer had mentioned. Concern politely expressed. The Senate's version of criticism. He had wanted Fabius reduced. He had wanted it when the army was divided. He had wanted it when Rome voted to give him equal authority. He had wanted it through 6 weeks of watching Fabius on the West Ridge. Not moving, not fighting, not appearing to do anything. He looked at the plain. The grain stores Hannibal was building near Geronium were still there. His scouts had reported them this morning. The 20 wagons were a reduction, not a significant one. He looked south. He looked at the low hill to the east of the plain. The ground rose there in a way that caught his attention every time he looked at it. The tree line at the base gave way to open slope. The slope looked gradual from here. At the top, the sight lines were excellent. He had been looking at that hill for 6 weeks, since he first arrived at this camp. He needed to be on it. Not today. Today was the letter day. Today was the day to acknowledge the action and think about what came next. The hill was what came next. Not today. He thought about Fabius. In 6 weeks they had spoken perhaps 12 times. Most of the conversations had been operational. Supply, patrol patterns, movement reports. Fabius spoke precisely and gave precise answers. He expected precise answers in return. The expectations were mutual. They had not spoken about strategy since the day of the division. Fabius had laid out the arrangement. East Ridge, West Ridge. Don't cross. Equal authority. He had been clear about equal. He had not emphasized it or made it a point. He had stated it as a fact. Equal. Then he had left. Minucius had spent 6 weeks thinking about what Fabius did with those 6 weeks. He knew what Fabius did. He walked. He observed. He declined every engagement. He moved his portion of the army in parallel with Hannibal's movements. He never let the distance close to fighting range. He gave Hannibal nothing. It was correct strategy. Minucius had accepted this. He had accepted it in the way you accepted a thing that was correct and insufficient at the same time. Correct and insufficient was the shape of Fabius's war. The hill was not insufficient. He came to Minucius's camp in the early morning. The camp was already active. Minucius ran an active camp. Patrols going out. Scouts coming in. The cooking fires going. Men in the process of their morning work. He walked through it without stopping. Officers saw him and considered approaching and decided not to. He had the kind of walk that made people decide not to approach. Not hostile. Something quieter than hostile. Occupied. He found Minucius at the eastern edge. Minucius saw him coming from 50 yards and went to meet him. This was the correct thing to do. When your commander of equal rank came to your camp unannounced, you went to meet him. You did not make him come to you. They walked to the eastern edge together. They stood at the edge and looked south. The morning was cool. September. The heat of August was gone, but the days were still warm. In the early morning, before the sun reached the ridge, the air had the quality of a different season. The smell of it was different. Dry grass. Something that might be coming from the south, from the plain below. The particular smell of a large number of men in a specific place. Hannibal's camp. He could not see it from here. It was beyond the horizon of the ridge. But the smell of a large army in one place was its own kind of presence. The hill was visible to the southeast. It was not a dramatic hill. That was one of the things that made it interesting. A dramatic hill announced its importance. This one was understated. The slope was gradual. The top was broad and flat. The tree line at the base looked like ordinary vegetation. From a distance, in the morning light, it looked like ordinary terrain. He had walked it 3 weeks ago. He had gone on a morning when his camp was quiet and his officers were handling the routine work. He had gone alone. He had told one officer where he was going and when to expect him back. He had not explained why. He had walked the approach from the north. He had noted the gradual slope. He had noted the way the gradient changed in the upper section. He had climbed to the summit. The sight lines were excellent. He had understood immediately why the hill looked good from the ridge. Then he had walked the south face. This was the habit. You walked the obvious side. Then you walked the other side. The obvious side was what everyone saw. The other side was what was there. On the south face he had found the draw. Not immediately. It was behind the tree line. You had to enter the tree line and walk 60 yards south. Then the ground dropped. The draw became visible. The draw ran east for approximately 2 miles. It was wide. At the base of the draw, the ground was soft but passable. He had walked 100 yards into it and looked back at the hill rising on the north side. A man standing in the draw could not be seen from the summit. He could hear sounds from the summit. He could hear commands if commands were given, but he could not be seen. The draw was wide enough for 2,000 cavalry. He had stood in the draw for a while. He had pressed his hands flat against his sides. Then he had walked back out. "The hill," Fabius says. "It was not a question." "Yes," Minucius says. "I walked it." Minucius looked at him. "When?" "3 weeks ago, before you moved your camp here." Minucius was quiet. He had not known this. Fabius had walked the hill 3 weeks ago, before Minucius had arrived at this position. That meant something. It meant Fabius had been thinking about this hill for longer than Minucius had been looking at it. It meant the old man was paying attention to things Minucius had not yet seen. He was not sure what to do with this. "The top is good," Fabius says. "The sight lines are good. The approach looks gradual from here." "It is gradual," Minucius says. "It looks gradual," Fabius says. "The last 300 yards steepen. Not dramatically. Enough." Minucius thought about the last 300 yards. He had been calculating the approach from the ridge. The calculation had been visual. The ground from here looked gradual throughout. If the last 300 yards steepened, the calculation changed. Not dramatically. Enough. He heard the echo of Fabius's phrasing in his own thought. "There is a draw on the south side," Fabius says. "Behind the tree line. You cannot see it from here. It runs east for about 2 miles. It is wide enough for cavalry. At least 2,000. Minucius was looking at the hill, the tree line at the base. He was trying to see the draw from here. He could not. The tree line was dense enough at this distance to conceal anything behind it. 2,000 cavalry. "I did not see it from the top either," Fabius says. "I had to walk the south face to find it." This was the thing Minucius heard clearly. He did not see it from the top. He had walked the south face specifically to find the things he could not see from the top. Minucius thought about whether he would have done that. He thought about his relationship to terrain. He looked at terrain quickly and read it quickly, and the reading was usually accurate. The overall expression of the terrain was usually what he thought it was. He thought about the times the reading had been wrong. He thought about Spain, a position that had looked open from a ridge, that had a ridge behind it that compressed the approach. He had not walked it. He had taken the visual. He had moved and found the compression. It had not been catastrophic. It had cost him a formation reorganization under fire, which was an expensive thing to need. He had not walked the south face. "He knows about the hill," Fabius says. "You believe he has prepared for it. I believe he has prepared for something. The hill is the obvious thing. It could also be the obvious thing he has not prepared for," Minucius says, "because he expects us to think he has." Fabius looked at him. This was the argument that was sometimes right. The second-level argument. The argument that said, "The enemy has anticipated your caution, so the caution is itself the trap." It was the kind of argument that sounded like insight. It was sometimes insight. It was also sometimes the argument a man made when he had already decided, when he needed a reason that sounded considered. "Yes," Fabius says, "it could be that. But you do not think so." "I do not think so," Fabius says. "He has been moving in that area for 3 weeks. The draw has been prepared. The forage patterns around that hill are different from his patterns elsewhere. He is leaving the approaches to the hill clear. A man who leaves approaches clear has not forgotten about the hill." Minucius looked at the hill. He thought, Fabius has been watching the forage patterns for 3 weeks. He has been noting the differences. He has been building a picture of what is there from the things that are not there. This is the slow war. This is what it looks like from the inside. He thought the forage patterns. He had not looked at the forage patterns around the hill specifically. He had looked at Hannibal's forage patterns in general. He had noted the grain stores. He had noted the supply routes. He had not noted what was absent near the hill. What was absent near the hill was foragers. Hannibal was not foraging near the hill, which meant the hill was a military position, which meant it was being kept clear for operational reasons. Minucius pressed his hands against his sides. "I hear what you are saying," Minucius says. He had meant to stop there. "Good," Fabius says. "I am not sure I agree with it." Fabius nodded once. He had come here not because he believed he would change Minucius's mind. He had come because he had an obligation to try. The obligation and the outcome were different things. He had learned the difference at some cost over 40 years of commands large and small. He turned and walked back toward his camp. Chapter 2. Come down. 3 days after Fabius's visit, Minucius went to the hill. He had thought about the draw on the south side. He had sent a scout. The scout had come back and confirmed. There was a draw. It ran from the low ground south of the hill to the east slope, approximately 40 feet wide at the narrowest, sufficient for cavalry to form in. The scout had not seen cavalry in the draw. He had concluded the draw was empty, a natural feature, not occupied. Fabius had warned him about a potential. The potential had not materialized. He took 4 cohorts and his best cavalry wing. He had been wrong about one thing. The scout had not seen cavalry in the draw. The cavalry was not there when the scout arrived. It arrived after, in the 4th hour of the night, at the pace of men who moved carefully in the dark and did not want to be heard. Hannibal had watched Minucius look at the hill for 6 weeks. He had walked the hill himself from the south side. He had found the draw. He had measured the draw. He had placed a cavalry wing in the draw 3 days ago, before the scout arrived. He had moved them out before the scout's arrival time. He had moved them back afterward. He did not know that Fabius had also walked the hill. He had assumed the warning would not be given, or would not be listened to. He was correct about one of those things. The approach to the hill took 40 minutes. Minucius moved his infantry up the northwest face, which was what the terrain favored. The slope was gradual in the lower section. It steepened at 2/3 of the way up. He had planned for this. He had briefed his tribunes on the steeper section. They knew to keep the formation tight. The formation stayed tight. The morning was clear. The plain below was visible. He could see the main road. He could see the south end of the valley. He could not see the draw on the south side. The hill blocked the view. He brought the infantry to the top. He sent the cavalry around the east edge to cover the downslope. He stood at the summit and looked at the plain below. The plain was clear. He thought, "This is a good position." Then the south tree line moved. The Spanish infantry came out of the trees first. Not a skirmish line, a formed body, cohort-sized, moving at the pace of men who had been waiting and were now moving toward a specific target. Minucius turned. His cavalry was on the east edge. His infantry was on the summit. The Spanish were coming from the south. He had time. He had the high ground. He began to form his infantry to face south. Then the draw opened. The Numidian cavalry came out of the draw at a canter. They came out in 2 streams, one on each side of the draw mouth, and spread as they came. The spread was practiced in the way movements were practiced over years of doing the same thing in different places. Each horse found its gap. Each rider found the angle. They were between Minucius's cavalry and his infantry before the cavalry could respond. The shields lock. The man beside him smells of fear. He smells the same. Numidian horses to the left. Not charging. Circling. The javelin range. A javelin comes over from the right. It hits the shield boss. He holds. The Spanish infantry is pressing from below. He is holding the summit with 40 men and the formation is compressing because there is nowhere to expand. He pushes left. The man behind him pushes him forward. The man to his right is gone. He does not look to the right. He pushes forward. Pull back. From above, the hill is a small thing. The north slope is covered. The south side is empty ground between the draw and the summit. Moving up that empty ground from south and east. Numidian cavalry in 2 arcs. Spanish infantry in a line. At the summit, 4 cohorts, not 400 men. The hill had looked like a good position. From above it looks like a bowl. A bowl with the high sides being the forces coming in and the low center being everything Minucius had. The plain below does not move. The sun does not move. 20,000 men are watching this from a distance that makes them small. Then down again. Back to the summit. Back into the pushing. On the ridge above, Fabius was watching. He had been watching since Minucius's column left the base of the hill at dawn. He had watched the approach. He had watched the formation reach the summit. He had watched the south tree line move. He did not speak. His officers were behind him at the correct distance. Close enough to receive a command. Far enough not to be in the way of his watching. He watched the draw open. He watched the cavalry spread. He pressed his hands flat against his sides. He had thought about this for 3 weeks. Not this specific moment. The general case. He had walked the hill. He had found the draw. He had climbed the summit and looked at the angles. He had thought, if Minucius goes to this hill, this is what will happen. He had not been wrong about the shape of it. He turned to the officer on his left. He said, the 4 cohorts. The officer did not ask which 4. He had known which 4 for 3 weeks. He had known for 3 weeks that they might be needed. He said, through the back draw and around the south end of the ridge. 40 minutes at the double. The officer was already moving. On the summit, the formation was holding. Not advancing. Not retreating. Holding. The men who were holding had been selected by Minucius for this action. He had selected them because they were his best. Because the action required the best. He had been correct about this. They held. The Numidian cavalry circled and threw javelins. The javelins came at different angles. Some came in from the east. Some came from the south, over the heads of the Spanish infantry. Each javelin that landed changed the size of the formation. The men closed the gaps by compressing. The formation got smaller. It held. The 4 fresh cohorts came around the south end of the ridge at the double. They were fresh and moving fast. Men who knew what they were moving toward, who had decided before they arrived. The Numidian cavalry heard them first, then saw them. The cavalry stopped circling. The cavalry reformed. The cavalry made the calculation that all cavalry made when fresh infantry arrived at the engagement. The ratio had changed. The calculation changed with the ratio. The cavalry withdrew toward the draw. The Spanish infantry had been pressing from below. When the cavalry withdrew, the pressure from the east stopped. The pressure from below continued, then stopped. The Spanish infantry could see the 4 fresh cohorts coming around the south end. The Spanish infantry withdrew. It withdrew in order. This was significant, not broken, in order. Hannibal's infantry did not break when it withdrew. It withdrew and it was still usable afterward. This was important information. Fabius noted it. Minucius came down last. He had sent his men first, which was correct. He had waited until the last cohort was moving, until the formation was disengaging in order. Then he had started down. He walked the slope. He placed his feet carefully. The slope was steep in the upper section. As Fabius had said, he walked all the way down. He reached the base. He stood in front of Fabius. Fabius looked at him. There was a period of silence. Not long, not uncomfortable. The silence of two men who had understood what had just happened. Fabius looked at the hill. He thought about the 4 cohorts. He thought about the calculation he had made 3 weeks ago, the route and the timing and the ratio change. He felt something briefly. He set it aside. He looked at Minucius. Minucius was looking at the hill, not at Fabius, at the hill. He was doing the thing that capable men did after a failure. He was looking at the failure, not looking away, not reformulating it as something other than what it was. Fabius said, "Your men held the formation." He said it because it was true, because it was the thing that was most important in what had just happened. Minucius looked at him. He said, "I was warned." "Yes," Fabius says. "I calculated that the warning accounted for a possibility that had not materialized." "Yes, I was wrong." Fabius said nothing. Minucius looked at the hill for another moment. Then he looked back at Fabius. He said, "I owe you my command." Fabius said nothing. "More than my command," Minucius says. Fabius said, "You owe your men a better calculation next time." Minucius looked at him. Then he said a word. The word was Patronus. In Roman usage, the word meant something between commander and protector and father. It was not a military word. It was a family word. The Romans used it for a debt that could not be expressed in the language of contracts. Fabius heard the word. He did not respond to it. He turned and walked back toward the ridge at his usual pace. He was not satisfied. Satisfaction was the wrong response. Nothing permanent had happened. Hannibal's forces had withdrawn in order and would be operational by morning. Minucius's men had come down without their formation destroyed. The result was, nothing permanent had happened. He had bought some time. He did not know how much. That night, sitting in the field, Minucius called a meeting with his officers. He said, "I went to a hill I had been told not to go to. I brought 4 cohorts into a position that was not what I thought it was. The result was survivable because of action taken by the dictator's forces." He paused. He said, "I will not give you a version of this that makes it different from what it was." His officers looked at him. He said, "What happened was that I was wrong. A man who was not wrong came down the ridge with 4 fresh cohorts and changed the ratio. That is what happened. He sent them back to their units. He sat outside his tent for a long time. He thought about the draw on the south side of the hill. The draw that had been there when Fabius walked the hill 3 weeks ago. The draw that had been there when his scout arrived. The draw that had not been empty. He thought. The scout did not see the cavalry because the cavalry was not there. Then it was there. He thought about the kind of thinking that required. He pressed his hands flat on his knees. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. When he slept, he slept. The field goes quiet. The plain below was still in shadow when they left the ridge. The stars were still visible to the west. To the east, the sky was lightening. The particular gray of the hour before dawn, the gray that was almost a color. In an hour, it would be full light. The plain would be visible. His position on the hill would be visible from the plain. He needed to reach the summit before full light. He calculated as he moved. The base of the hill was 300 yards from the ridge base. He had moved his column down the back draw and around the south end of the ridge. Adding time. avoiding observation from the plain. The total approach was now 700 yards to the base and then the full climb from there. He had moved fast from the back draw. He thought about the south face as he moved. He thought about what Fabius had said. The draw behind the tree line. He thought about walking the south face when he reached the base. He had told his officer he would walk it. He intended to. He also knew that in 40 minutes of moving fast, the light would have changed. The south face walk would add time. Time was the thing he did not have if the draw was active. If cavalry was in the draw and waiting, time was what they were waiting for him to run out of. He kept moving. He told himself, walk the south face at the base. He told himself this twice. Then the base arrived. The slope was in front of him. He was calculating the gradient and the timing. He gave the order to ascend. He did not walk the south face. He had intended to. He gave the order and the formation began moving up. The first 200 yards went well. The slope was as gradual as it had looked from the camp. The ground was dry and firm. The grass on the slope was autumn grass, dry and pressed low to the earth. Good footing. The men moved at the pace he set. He could hear them behind him. The particular sound of 3 cohorts moving uphill. The breath of it. The shuffle of the feet finding purchase on the incline. The low creak of equipment. He was at the front. He was always at the front of the approach. Not in combat. In combat he went to the point of decision, which was usually the flank, not the van. But in the approach he led. His officers had stopped asking why. It was what he did. He moved up the first 200 yards and felt the slope under his feet. The gradient was correct. He had read it correctly from the camp. He felt the ground. Firm, dry. The kind of footing that did not give under a sandal. He thought, the reading was accurate. He thought, the last 300 yards steepen. He was still in the first 200. The gradient changed at the point Fabius had described. Not dramatically, not a cliff, not even a sharp change. The slope increased by perhaps 1 part in 5. Over 100 yards you felt this. Over 200 yards you felt it in your legs. Over 300 yards you felt it in the men behind you. The formation changed as the gradient increased. This was automatic. Men moving uphill on a steeper gradient unconsciously compressed toward each other. The intervals tightened. The flanks moved toward the center. This was correct for the gradient. It was correct. It was also a vulnerability. A compressed formation was less capable of responding to a lateral threat. He could hear the breathing of his men change. Not labored, not yet, but the rhythm of it was different from the first 200 yards. The full kit ascent was taking something from them. He had factored this in. He had factored in the gradient change that Fabius had described. He had calculated that his men would still be effective at the top. He kept moving. The tree line on the south side was to his left. Dense. Close. The shadow of it lay across the lower slope in the early light. He looked at it as he moved. He looked at it the way you looked at a thing you were holding information about. Not alarmed. Aware. He kept moving. The first sound came from the right. Not metal. Not a voice. Movement. The particular texture of a large number of things moving through dry scrub. Things that had mass and height. Things that made the low metallic sound of equipment when equipment moved through vegetation. He knew this sound. He had heard it in Spain once at the wrong time. A cavalry unit moving through brush on a hillside above him, trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding. He had heard it and understood it immediately and had moved his formation before the sound resolved into anything visible. He stopped. The formation stopped behind him. Not a command. The stop passed backward through the column the way a stop passed through water. The first man stopped, then the next, then the next. Within 5 seconds, the full column was still. He listened. The sound from the right was close. The slope on the right dropped away. He could not see what was below it from his position. The tree line on the north side began at the base of the drop. He had seen the north tree line from the camp. He had noted it. He had not walked it. He had not walked the south face either. He listened to the sound from the right. He was calculating the distance, the direction, the number. Sound in dry scrub was not accurate information, but it was information. A large number of things moving through dry scrub made a sound with a certain density. This sound was dense. Not 50 men, not 100. More. His senior officer came up beside him. "Right flank," the officer says. His voice was flat. He had been in the field long enough to keep his voice flat when his voice wanted to be otherwise. "Yes," Minucius says. He was still listening. He could smell it now. The smell Fabius had described without describing it. The smell of horses that had been standing in a confined place for hours. The particular smell of large animals at rest. Their warmth, their waste, their breath accumulated in a space with nowhere to go. They had been in the draw since before dawn. He pressed his hands against his sides. Then the left. The same sound from the south tree line. Not from the draw. From the near end of the tree line where the draw opened into the slope. Moving northeast. Moving fast. He turned and looked back down the slope. The base of the hill was 400 yards below him. The approach was still open. The ground between his formation and the base was still open. For now. For now was the critical phrase. He thought, how fast can Numidian cavalry move on that ground? He knew the answer. He had watched Numidian cavalry operate for weeks from the ridge. They moved at the canter on open ground. On a hillside they moved more carefully. Still faster than infantry. He thought, 400 yards. 90 seconds for infantry running. 60 for cavalry at the canter. He looked left and right. He was not yet surrounded. The Numidians from the draw were at the south tree line, moving northeast. They had not yet cleared the tree line to get between him and the base. The cavalry from the right flank had not yet come over the ridge drop to his right. He had approximately 60 seconds. "We go back," Minucius says. Not loudly. The formation was close enough to hear a normal voice. His officer was already turning. He had thought about this moment for 3 weeks. Not this specific moment. The general case. He had walked the hill, found the draw, climbed back to the ridge, sat with what he had found. He had thought, if Minucius goes to this hill, this is what will happen. He had thought through the scenario with the specific numbers he had. 3 or 4 cohorts was the number Minucius would bring. Without cavalry because the approach favored infantry. The Numidians would come out of the draw. The Spanish infantry would come from the north tree line. The formation would be trapped on the slope. He had thought, what can I do from the ridge when this happens? He had thought about this for 3 weeks. He had concluded, 4 cohorts. Ready. The route through the back draw and around the south end of the ridge was 40 minutes at the double. 4 cohorts arriving at the base while the Numidians were still positioning would change the ratio. He had not told anyone he was keeping 4 cohorts ready for this specific purpose. He had not told Minucius. He had warned Minucius about the draw and the hill and had not told him about the 4 cohorts. He had thought about whether to tell him. He had decided not to. He had thought, if I tell him about the 4 cohorts, he will go to the hill. The rescue plan will make the risk acceptable. The risk was not acceptable. So he had kept the 4 cohorts ready and had not explained why. His senior officer had understood that the dictator wanted 4 cohorts ready and had asked no questions. He had watched the draw every day for 3 weeks. He had watched the Numidian cavalry that moved in and out of the draw on Hannibal's operational pattern. He had watched the pattern change 12 days ago. The Numidians had gone into the draw and had not come out. They were in the draw. Still, he was certain of this. He had been certain since yesterday. He had not gone to tell Lucius yesterday. He had gone this morning as planned and had told him about the draw. He had seen that Lucius understood. He had seen that Lucius was going to go anyway. He had come back to his camp and told his senior officer, 4 cohorts, full kit. Be ready. He saw the Numidians come out of the draw before Lucius did. He was higher. He could see the tree line from the east end. He could see the draw entrance. He had known where to look since the day he walked the south face. The Numidians came out of the draw at the canter, not the gallop. Canter first. They were positioning, going to the gallop when they had the position. He saw this. He said nothing. He turned and went to his senior officer. 4 cohorts, he says. Full kit. We move in 10 minutes. The officer did not ask why. He went. Fabius stood at the edge of the camp while the cohorts assembled. He watched the assembly and thought about what he was doing. He was going to go down. He had been on the ridge for 2 months. He had watched Hannibal's army operate in the plain below for 2 months. He had watched farms burn and had not gone down. He had watched men question his command and had not gone down. He had watched the tribal assembly give half his army to another man and had complied without going down. Now he was going down. Not because the strategy required it. The strategy did not require it. The strategy would have been served by letting this play out. Letting Lucius's formation take its losses on the slope. Come back damaged. The lesson he had not been willing to receive as instruction. The strategy would have been served by staying on the ridge. He was not staying on the ridge. He thought about the 2,200 men on that slope. He thought about the 4 cohorts forming up behind him. He thought about the route to the base of the hill. He thought about what the Numidians would do when 4 fresh cohorts arrived at the base from an unexpected direction. He had calculated this. The Numidians were excellent. He acknowledged this. They were the best light cavalry he had seen in his career. Light cavalry committed to a net position had limited flexibility against a new threat from a different direction. The net required the cavalry to hold their positions. Fresh infantry arriving at the base of the hill would pull them off the net. This would work. He was fairly certain it would work. He walked to his horse. 4 cohorts moved down from the ridge at the double. They came down the back of the ridge. The same route the Roman column had used this morning. In reverse. Down the back draw. Around the south end of the ridge. Then east toward the base of the hill. Fabius rode at the front. He had not ridden at the front of a moving force in this campaign. He had ridden with his cavalry, in the center observing. He had ridden at the flank of the column on the march. He had not ridden at the front of a force moving toward contact. He rode at the front. His officers behind him had not expected this. He could feel the change in the formation when he moved to the front. Something that passed backward through the column. Not alarm. The opposite of alarm. Men who saw their commander move to the front understood something. He kept the pace below the gallop. The infantry behind him needed to arrive with something left. This was basic. You did not double the infantry for 40 minutes and then ask them to fight at full capacity immediately. You doubled them for 40 minutes and gave them a minute to reform. 1 minute. He rode at the pace that kept the infantry just below the limit. The Numidian cavalry saw the 4 cohorts coming around the south end of the ridge. Still 300 yards away. He had been expecting this. Numidian cavalry always saw things first. Their scouts were forward. Their riders were positioned high. They saw the 4 cohorts and they assessed. The assessment took approximately 30 seconds. He watched it happen. He could see the nearest Numidian groups shift. Not away, sideways, repositioning to assess the new threat. Small movements, the kind that looked like nothing unless you knew what you were watching. He had been watching Numidian cavalry for 2 months. He was watching them calculate. The calculation was, for fresh cohorts arriving from the west, moving toward the base of the hill. The Numidian net was distributed across the south slope. Moving the net to intercept while maintaining the slope position would require splitting the groups. Splitting the groups reduced the net below the point where it could hold either the formation or the new arrivals. They were not going to split. He had known they would not split. This was the calculation he had made 3 weeks ago. Split the net, lose both positions. Hold the net, and 4 fresh cohorts arrive at the base. They chose to move, not toward him, away from the base, up the south slope, back toward the draw. They were abandoning the net position, not in disorder. Numidian cavalry did not move in disorder. They moved the way water moved, cohesive, fluid, reforming as they went, moving the net up the slope, back toward their reserve position. He watched them go. He kept the 4 cohorts moving. They reached the base of the hill. He gave the order to halt. 1 minute. The men breathed. He watched the infantry reform from the column into a line. They were breathing hard, but the bodies were still moving correctly. This was the minimum. You needed the bodies to move correctly. If the bodies were still moving correctly, you could work with the rest. 1 minute. He rode to the front of the line. He looked up the slope. He could see Minucius's formation, still holding. The Spanish infantry had pulled back when the 4 cohorts appeared at the base. The Spanish infantry were good soldiers. Good soldiers understood ratios. The ratio had changed. Advance, he says. The line moved. He rode at the left end of the line. This gave him the sight line to the south slope. He watched the Numidians as he rode. They were still pulling back, still moving up. The leading groups had reached the draw entrance. He watched. The middle groups of the Numidian net pulled back further. He watched them pass the tree line. He watched them enter the draw. The draw closed over them. The south slope was clear. He thought about the draw as he rode. He had found it 3 weeks ago. He had stood in it. He had walked the first 100 yards. He had turned back and climbed to the ridge and sat with what he had found. He had carried the draw with him since. Not anxiously, the way you carried a known problem. You kept it somewhere accessible. You updated it as new information arrived. The new information arrived daily. The Numidian movement patterns in the valley. The absence of foraging near the hill. The supply route adjustments that indicated Hannibal was keeping the south approaches clear for a specific reason. He had updated the draw in his thinking every few days. He had kept the 4 cohorts ready. He had not told Minucius about the 4 cohorts. He had thought about whether to tell him. He had told him about the draw this morning. He had not told him about the cohorts. He had calculated this. If he told Minucius he had 4 cohorts ready, Minucius would go to the hill. The support plan would make the risk feel manageable. The risk was not manageable. 3 cohorts on a slope with Numidian cavalry in a hidden draw was not a manageable risk. It was an unacceptable risk with a support plan attached. He had kept it to himself. His senior officer had kept the 4 cohorts at readiness for 3 weeks. He had asked no questions. He was the kind of officer who understood that the explanation would arrive when it was needed. It had arrived this morning. He rode up the slope. The formation behind him was moving. 4 cohorts of heavy infantry moving uphill, toward 3 cohorts that had been on the slope for nearly an hour. The 4 cohorts were fresh and the 3 were not. and this was visible in the way each moved. The fresh cohorts moved at a pace. The held cohorts, as he passed the point where he could see them clearly, were standing. Standing. He had expected more damage. He rode toward the held cohorts. As he came closer, he could see the men. He could see the faces. Not clearly, not at distance, but he could see the posture. The posture of men who had been holding for a long time and had not broken. That was the word. Not broken. He thought about the men Minucius had selected for this. He thought about what it said about the man who had selected them and put them in this situation. He did not complete the thought. He rode to the base of the held formation. He looked up at the men. They looked back at him. The Spanish infantry was gone. The Numidians were in the draw. The slope was clear. He said nothing. They sat on the ridge as the sun went down. Minucius's men were in the camp. The wounded were being treated. The count was being done. There were fewer dead than there should have been, given what the hillside had been 40 minutes ago. This was the count that mattered. Not the wagons taken. Not the ground held. The count of men who had gone out and come back. Fabius sat outside his tent. He was not doing anything, just sitting. He had been sitting since they came back up the ridge. His officers had come in sequence to report, and he had listened, and they had gone away. The reports were brief. He had given them nothing to report back about. They had gone. The sun was going down behind the western ridge. The light was the particular autumn light of an hour before dark. Long and gold and lateral. It made the ridge look different from the way it looked in the morning. The morning was gray and accurate. This light was warm and imprecise. He watched the shadows extend from the east. Minucius came across the 50 yards at the hour before dark. He came without his officers. He walked at his usual pace and then slower. By the time he reached Fabius's camp, he was walking at a pace he rarely used. The pace of a man covering ground that was not ground he wanted to cover. He stood in front of Fabius. Fabius did not stand. He had thought about whether to stand. He had thought. Standing would acknowledge a formality. Standing would signal that what was happening was formal. What was happening was not formal. It was the thing underneath formal. He looked up at Minucius. The light was going. The autumn light that had been gold and lateral 20 minutes ago was fading. Minucius's face was in the last of it. He had thought, on the walk back up the ridge, about what Minucius would do when he came. He had thought about the varieties, the kind who explained, who enumerated the factors. The intelligence about the draw was incomplete. The speed of the Numidians was underestimated. The gradient had been understated. He had thought, all of these things are true and none of them are the main thing. He had thought, the main thing is that I warned him. He listened and he went anyway. He had thought about what kind of man said the first thing, what kind said the second. He had not made a prediction. He knew what kind of man he thought Minucius was. He also knew that knowledge about a man did not always predict what he did in a specific moment. What Minucius said was this. He reached into his belt and took out the document, the official copy of the Assembly's vote, his equal authority. He held it out. Fabius looked at it. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it. He looked at the document and at the hand holding it. He thought about the tribal assembly vote. He had been in Rome when the vote was taken. He had received the official notification in his camp the following afternoon. He had read it and had written 2 letters and had sent them. He thought about the word the vote had created. Equal. He had lived with the word for 6 weeks. He had felt its shape. He had complied with it fully. He had not put a thumb on the scale. He thought, the assembly gave him this. That is yours, Fabius says. The assembly gave it to you. I am giving it back. Minucius says. You cannot give back what the assembly gave, Fabius says. Minucius held the document out. Then make clear I will not use it, Minucius says, that I will serve under your command, as I should have from the beginning. Fabius looked at it for a long moment. He thought about what taking it meant. He thought about what not taking it meant. He thought about the men 300 yards away in the east camp. What they knew about what was happening. What they would know by morning. He took the document. He did not say anything about the hill. He had thought about what to say when this moment came. He had thought about it clearly. On the descent, while the Numidians were pulling back, he had thought, he is going to come to me tonight. He is going to say something. What I say after will be what he remembers. He could say the draw. The draw was the thing. He could say, I walked it. I found it. I told you. He could say, next time walk the south face first. He could say, I walked it and I told you and you went anyway. He said none of these things. He said, your men held the formation. Minucius looked at him. On that slope, Fabius says, under that pressure, they held. That is your work. Minucius was quiet. You came down, he says. Yes, Fabius says. I did not know if you would. I did not know if I would, Fabius says. Until I did. This was true. He had known he should. He had not known he would until he was saying, 4 cohorts, full kit, 10 minutes. The should and the would were different. Minucius stood there for a moment longer. He said the word. He said it quietly, in Latin. The word for the thing that existed between a man who had saved you and the saved. The word that carried obligation and loyalty and a debt that could not be repaid in kind. Patronus, he says, father, patron, the man who stands between you and the ending. Fabius heard the word. He accepted it the way he accepted most things. Without expression. Without sentimentality. He held it the same way he held the document. He said, go back to your men. Minucius walked back across the 50 yards. The light was gone now. The ridge was dark except for the fires. The fires of the west camp and the east camp. Visible to each other across 300 yards. He walked at his pace. Fast. He was always at his pace. His men were watching. Not all of them. The ones who had been on the hillside. The ones who had held the formation. They had been watching since Minucius walked to Fabius's camp. One of them said a word. He said it quietly, the way men said things they were not sure they were permitted to say, but saying anyway because the moment was the kind of moment that permitted it. He said, Pater, Father. Then the man next to him said the same word. Then more of them, across the 50 yards of dark ground between the two camps, to the old man sitting outside his tent. Not loudly. The night was quiet enough. The word traveled across 50 yards of dark. Fabius sat outside for a long time after. He heard the word. He acknowledged it the way you acknowledged a thing that was real without making it into something else. He let it be what it was. He thought about what had happened on the hill today. He thought about the process, not the result. He had processed the result while riding back up the ridge. The result was, nothing permanent had happened. The hill was empty. Hannibal's forces were intact and operational. Minucius's men had come down. The ridge was the same ridge. He thought about the process. He had gone down. 2 months on the ridge. Holding. Watching. Not coming down. Then he had come down. He thought about what had made him do it. Not the 4 cohorts. The 4 cohorts were planning. He had made the plan 3 weeks ago when he walked the hill. The plan was not the decision. The decision was simpler. 2,200 men were on that slope. 4 cohorts were in his camp. He had a road to the base. He was the one with authority over the 4 cohorts. That was the complete reasoning. He had told himself, writing down, "This is about the army, not Minucius. The army. You kept the army. You did not let it be reduced on a hillside by a trap you had seen coming." He held this reasoning. He also thought, there is a difference between what you tell yourself you are doing and what you are doing. He had watched Minucius's formation for 40 minutes. He had moved the moment the Numidians came out of the draw. He had not paused to recalculate. He pressed his hands flat against his legs. He did not resolve this. He held it. Some things were for holding, not resolving. He thought about Minucius, the man who had gone to the hill after being warned, who had held the formation for an hour on a slope, who had come down last, who had walked across 50 yards in the dark and said, "I was wrong." He thought, capable men who say "I was wrong" without building a structure of explanation are not common. In 40 years he had known many capable men. He had known fewer who did what Minucius had done in the moment after a failure. Not explaining, not enumerating factors, looking at the failure and saying the simplest true thing. He had used the word, patronus. The word carried obligations in the old Roman understanding. You could not refuse them. The word conferred them. He had not wanted the obligation. He had also not refused it. He sat with this for a while. He thought about the elections. 2 months. Then the dictatorship expired and the consuls would take command. 2 men, each with half the command. The constitutional division. The division that was designed to prevent what kings had been. He had 2 names from his networks in Rome. Gaius Terentius Varro. He had watched Varro speak twice. He understood what Varro was. Not incompetent. He had held office. He had served in the field. He knew the army the way a man knew a tool he had used but not made. What Varro understood very well was the anger in a room. He could find it and give it a direction. The anger in Rome was real. The farms had burned. The dictator had not fought. The tribal assembly had been required to act. The anger had been building for months. Varro would give it a direction. He suspected the direction was a full engagement. The entire army on a field against Hannibal. The battle Hannibal had been trying to create for 8 months. The battle on ground Hannibal would choose because Hannibal always chose the ground. He pressed his hands flat against his legs. The other name was Lucius Aemilius Paullus. He had heard it twice in the same week from men who had no connection to each other. Military service in the East. 2 campaigns. The kind of officer who had a reputation for walking terrain before committing to it. Names that came from unrelated sources in the same week were worth attention. He would try to speak with Paullus before the elections. He would tell him about the draw, about Casilinum, about the shepherd's track, about the decision he had made when he said, "The upper north wall is not the problem." He would tell him about being right about the large thing, about being wrong about the small thing that destroyed it. He thought he may listen. He was not certain. Advice about ground was accepted only by men who had already been wrong about ground. In a specific way. In a way they remembered. Paullus had been in the East. The Eastern campaigns were different ground. He did not know what Paullus had been wrong about. He would find out. He would try. He went inside. Chapter 3. The Man the Forum Wanted. Fabius came home in January. He had been gone 6 months. He came back the way he had left. On foot. At his pace. With 2 guards and no announcements. Paullus was waiting outside the gate. He had arrived before dawn. He stood outside the gate on the Palatine Hill and waited. January in Rome. The cold before sunrise settled low, near the stones. It moved in off the river during the last hours of darkness. He had known there would be no one else waiting. He had known this before he came. He had not allowed it to change his decision to come. He had been standing there for 2 hours when the gate opened. Fabius came through it without ceremony. He saw Paullus. He was not surprised. He stopped. "You didn't have to," Fabius says. "I know," Paullus says. Fabius looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come in." They sat in the garden. The fig tree was bare. January. The garden had the look of a garden that had been maintained while someone was away. Maintained correctly, not tended. There was a difference. A slave brought drinks they did not ask for. Fabius sent him away. He came back with food. Fabius sent him away again. "The forum is going to want to know," Paullus says. "What the forum wants has not changed," Fabius says. "No. The forum wants a battle." "Yes." Fabius pressed his hands flat on his knees. "They will get one," he says, "whether or not the ground is correct." He had been saying this since before the appointment. The appointment was over. 6 months. The Senate had thanked him. The Senate praised him with the careful language of men relieved to see him step back. He had accepted the praise with the same expression he brought to everything. Nothing. He had asked Paullus to come to the forum with him on the day the election was scheduled. Paullus had come. Gaius Terentius Varro was 46 years old. His father had been in the meat trade, successful enough that the family moved into the equestrian class. Varro had used that position to enter the Senate. Administrative posts in the eastern provinces first. Minor military service in 2 campaigns, neither distinguished. He had never commanded an army in a general engagement. He had one skill that none of this required, and all of it had refined. He could speak to a crowd and make the crowd feel that its anger was correct. The forum in January was not a difficult crowd. 2 years of war. The farms in Campania burned. The grain from the south not arriving on schedule. The second winter colder than the first. Hannibal still in Italy. Still alive. Still moving through Roman territory as if the territory were his. Fabius back in Rome with nothing to show for 6 months. The name Cunctator attached to him wherever he went. The anger was already there when Varro arrived. He did not create it. He found it. He stood in front of it. He let it move through him and back out into the assembly. It returned to the crowd as itself, but focused now. Given a direction. Converted from fear into something that felt like certainty. This was a skill Paullus had seen before. The skill was rare. It had nothing to do with being right. It had everything to do with the crowd's need to believe that someone understood their situation. He told the forum that Fabius had failed Rome. He did not say this directly. He said it through the arrangement of facts. He described the 6 months. He named the towns that had burned. He named the roads Hannibal had traveled without opposition. He mentioned, without emphasis, the farm of the dictator that had not burned. He did not connect these things explicitly. The forum connected them. He said, Rome had 140,000 men under arms. Hannibal had 50,000. The disparity was known. The question was why the disparity had not yet produced a result. He said the question without providing an answer. He let the forum provide the answer. The forum was happy to provide the answer. Paullus stood with Fabius at the edge of the forum and watched. He watched the crowd. He watched the arrangement of faces. He watched the particular motion that moved through a crowd when it heard what it wanted to hear. Not applause exactly. Something more structural. The settling that happened when something that had been uncertain became certain. He had been watching crowds since his father brought him to the forum at 11 years old. He had been watching for 35 years. He knew what this settling meant. He said to Fabius, "He is going to win." "Yes," Fabius says. And you, Fabius said nothing. You will not speak against him. No, Fabius says. Paullus looked at him. Why? Because speaking against him would be the thing they want me to do, Fabius says. They would use it. They would say, Fabius attacks the man the people chose. Fabius believes only senators should command armies. He paused. They would not be wrong that I believe this, but speaking would damage what comes next. Paullus waited. The next part was Varro. Someone had to tell Varro what the ground looked like. That someone could not have spent the past month opposing him. Paullus stood with this. They will give him the army, Fabius says. They will give it to him because they believe he will use it. They will be right that he will use it. Whether he uses it correctly is a different question. The vote was held the following morning. Varro was elected by a comfortable majority. For the second consul, the assembly chose Lucius Aemilius Paullus. He had not sought the position. He had been asked by men whose opinion he respected. He said yes. He could not construct a sufficient reason to say no. This was how he made most decisions, by removing the insufficient reasons until only the decision remained. He accepted the appointment. He went home that evening and unrolled the map he had been studying for a month. He put his finger on the plain below Cannae. He held it there. He thought, the question is whether the ground can be managed. He thought, the question is whether Varro will listen. He rolled the map. He went to bed. He did not think the question was answerable tonight. He had been standing here for 2 hours. The cold had moved through his cloak and into the fabric of his tunic and settled there. Not painful, present. The kind of cold that became a fact about the morning rather than an experience within it. He was aware of it, the way he was aware of the stone under his feet, the darkness of the road before sunrise. He had nothing to do while he waited. This was unusual for him. He was a man who worked in preparation the way other men worked in action. When he was not in the field, he was reading reports. When he was not reading reports, he was going over reports he had already read, looking for the thing he had not seen the first time. He had found useful things this way, things that were in the reports all along. He had nothing to read here. He stood and waited and watched the road, the Palatine Hill in January, the old families behind their walls, the houses of men who had served Rome for generations. Some of them had been senators when he was a young officer in the East. Some of them had been consuls. He had served in campaigns with their sons. He knew the history of many of these walls, the particular history that accumulated behind walls that had stood in one place for 2 centuries. The marriages and the debts and the political alliances and the old favors owed and the older ones forgotten. He stood outside one of these walls and waited. He had come because it seemed like the correct thing to do. He had thought about it the night before and had not found a compelling reason not to. The man had been dictator for 6 months. He had done the work correctly. He was coming home. Someone should be at the gate. He had also come because there was something he needed to understand, not to be told. He could not be told what he needed to understand. He needed to stand in the same space as Fabius. Let the understanding arrive in whatever form it arrived. He had learned this across 30 years. Some understandings came from reports. Some came from terrain. Some came from standing near a man who had just done the thing you were about to attempt. He stood outside the gate in the January cold. He waited. He thought about Fabius on the road south. He had calculated the route. From the camp on the Campanian ridge to Rome was 12 days by the main road. Fabius had left on the day his appointment expired. He had not stayed 1 extra day. This was the kind of precision that told you something. He thought about the 6 months, what they had contained from the outside, which was what Rome could see. The farms burning, the army on the ridgelines, the dictator not descending, the word cunctator appearing first in the markets, then in the Senate corridors, then in formal correspondence. He had watched this happen. He had not been surprised. He had been something quieter than surprised. Resigned was not quite the word. He had simply recognized the pattern. He had seen it before with other men in other campaigns. A man does the correct thing. The correct thing is not visible. What is visible is the thing he did not do. Rome decides accordingly. He had been at a dinner in November. 6 men with no military experience explained what Fabius should have done differently. He had eaten his food. He had drunk his wine. He had left before the discussion reached its conclusion. He had counted the exits when he arrived, which he always did. 3. Fabius Maximus had been dictator of Rome for 6 months. The office of dictator was the Republic's emergency provision. Fabius was the dictator. He had taken the office in the summer. Trasimene was new. The shock of it was still moving through the city. He had gone south immediately. He had gone without declarations and without speeches. He had taken the army to the high ground and begun the slow work of following and harassing and denying. In those 6 months, he had not accepted a single major engagement. He had followed Hannibal through Samnium. He had followed him through Campania. He had harassed the foraging parties. He had cut supply lines where the ground allowed it. He had occupied every pass and ridge and high road that gave him advantage. He had done all of this correctly. Rome had watched the farms in Campania burn. Rome had decided that a man who watched farms burn was a coward. They gave him a name by December, cunctator, the delayer. They did not mean it with respect. They meant it as contempt. The contempt of men who had been afraid for a long time. Men who need somewhere to put the fear. The fear had to land somewhere. It had landed on Fabius. He had been right to do what he did. Rome had decided he was a coward. These were not contradictory positions. They were simply evaluated by different methods. The method the Forum used was not the method that produced correct strategy. He had understood this for a long time. He had watched this pattern across 30 years of public life. A correct decision and an unpopular one were often the same decision. They were simply called different things by different people in different rooms. The gate on the Palatine opened just after sunrise. The day Varro gave his most important speech, the Forum was packed. He had been speaking there for a week, working up to this. Each speech was slightly larger than the last. Each one found the same basic shape and ran it a different way. The approach was professional. Not the sign of a cynical man exactly. The sign of a man who understood that the same truth needed different clothing for different people. He was reaching all of them. He told the Forum that Fabius had failed Rome. He did not say this directly. He said it through the arrangement of facts. He described the 6 months. He named the towns that had burned. He named the roads Hannibal had traveled without opposition. He mentioned, without emphasis, the farm of the dictator that had not burned. He did not connect these things explicitly. He presented them and let the Forum connect them. The Forum connected them. He told them what Rome needed. Not a man who watched. A man who acted. Not a man who argued for strategy. A man who understood that the army existed to fight, and that the army had not fought. He said, "We will go south. We will find him on open ground. We will bring 80,000 men." He told them that numbers on open ground solved most tactical problems. He said this with the confidence of a man who had done the calculation and found it complete. Paullus had done the same calculation. He had arrived at a different answer. The calculation was not about numbers. The numbers were real. 86,000 against 60,000. On open ground with full freedom of maneuver, the larger number won. This was not wrong. The problem was the phrase "on open ground with full freedom of maneuver." Open ground with full freedom of maneuver was not a fact about the engagement. It was an assumption about the engagement. The assumption was true if you were the one choosing the ground. It was false if the other man was choosing it. Hannibal had been choosing the ground. Paullus had watched this for 18 months from a careful distance. He had read every report. He had spoken to survivors. He had looked at the maps of Trebia and Trasimene, with the specific purpose of understanding what Hannibal had understood before those battles began. He had reached a conclusion. Hannibal's advantage was not his army. It was not his cavalry, though the cavalry was excellent. It was not his intelligence about Roman formations, though his intelligence was accurate. His advantage was simpler. He chose the ground first. He chose it not in response to where Rome was going. He chose it before Rome knew where it was going. He read the likely movement. He identified the place. He prepared it. Then he found a reason for Rome to come there. At Trebia, the reason was a skirmish. Roman cavalry crossed a cold river to pursue a retreating screen. They crossed wet and cold. When they arrived, the formation was waiting. At Trasimene, the reason was the road. The only road through the hills ran along the lakeshore. Flaminius took it. At Cannae, the reason was the grain depot. Paullus stood at the edge of the comitia on the day of Varro's most important speech. He positioned himself where he could hear and also watch the faces. A crowd hearing what it wanted to hear had a specific expression. The jaw unclenched. The shoulders eased back slightly. The eyes went softer. Not the expression of people being persuaded. The expression of people being confirmed. People who had been given permission to believe what they already believed. He watched the forum confirm itself. He had watched this process many times over 30 years. A city afraid for 2 years needed a story that converted the fear into something with a clear solution. Varro's story was simple. The wrong generals. Fix the generals. The fear goes away. It was not a true story. It was a very useful one. He ran for consul in the same election. His speeches were different. He did not use the word cunctator. He did not use the word failure. He did not tell the forum what it wanted to hear. He said the army would move south. He said they would find the right ground and fight on Roman terms. He said this in an even voice. He built to nothing. He made no promises that the forum was waiting to hear. He stated his record. Eastern campaign, Northern campaign, service in the magistracy. He described 2 specific decisions he had made in the field. One had been criticized at the time. It was proven correct 6 months later. He did not ask the forum to remember this. He stated it. The forum was not excited by it. He did not try to excite them. He gave them a clear picture of what he was and what he intended. The forum voted for him anyway. A city that wants a certain kind of man still wants a serious man nearby. Someone to say wait when the first voice says go. Someone to count the supply lines when the other man is counting the glory. Paullus was elected because people sensed, without quite thinking it, that he was that weight. Not because they wanted to listen to him. Because they wanted him there in case they needed to. Varro and Paullus, consuls together, on alternating days. The Senate confirmed it in a single morning session. Paullus walked out of the curia into February cold. He stood at the top of the steps. Below him, the forum. He had been in public life for 30 years. He had been consul before in different times. He knew what the office felt like from the inside. It felt like a long series of decisions with consequences that returned to you later. He stood at the top of the steps and thought about the alternating command. One day his, one day Varro's. 86,000 men passing between them each morning like an object handed across a table. He had served under divided command before. He knew what it produced when two men agreed on the fundamental question. He knew what it produced when they did not. He and Varro did not agree about the fundamental question. The fundamental question was, what does Hannibal want? Varro's answer was, he wants to be defeated in the field. He is waiting for Rome to come and fight. On open ground with sufficient numbers, Rome can defeat him. His answer was, he wants Rome to come to the field he has chosen. He wants the specific conditions he has been preparing since he crossed the Alps. He wants numbers. He wants the flat plain. He wants the full weight of the Roman army in a single engagement, on ground where the full weight cannot maneuver. These answers produced different strategies. He felt no satisfaction at the election outcome. He found Varro still inside the curia, men around him calculating what the day was worth, the ordinary motion of political life after an election, congratulations moving from person to person, everyone arranging their position relative to the new power. We should talk about the South, Paullus said. The terrain reports, the supply situation near the Aufidus River. Varro clasped his arm. He was still in motion, still receiving congratulations, still filing the faces away for later use. He had a quality of being fully engaged with each person for exactly the time they required, then moving. We will talk, Varro said. There is time. He moved on. Another man was waiting with an outstretched arm. Paullus went home. He went to his study. He had a cartographer's map of the southern territories. Good map, made by a man who had actually walked the roads. Accurate river systems, terrain marks that reflected what the ground was actually like, not what a description of the ground would suggest. He unrolled it on the table. He put his finger on the Aufidus River and followed it east. The Aufidus ran along the edge of Apulia. Wide river, reliable water source year-round. In August, lower than in spring but still adequate for a large army. He followed the bend where the river turned south. There was a mark on the map where the river bent. A notation beside it, Grain Depot, established 8 years earlier to support campaigns in Apulia. The town on the rise above the water. The flat plain extending west and north from the town toward the lower hills. The town was called Cannae. He put his finger on it. He held it there. He had not yet been to that plain. He had read the scout reports from the previous summer. A small force had moved through the territory on a different mission. Open ground, mostly flat, low undulations that a formation crossed without difficulty. The kind of terrain a large army used completely. Every man at full width. Every advantage of numbers fully expressed. Rome was assembling the largest army in its history. He moved his finger from the town across the plain. North, west, south. He traced the shape of the open ground. It took a long time under his finger. He thought about what Fabius had said. From both sides of the formation. He thought about what both sides of the formation looked like at Cannae. On one side, Rome, 86,000 men, advancing across the flat ground. Numbers fully expressed. Width at maximum. The front rank meeting Hannibal's center at the widest possible engagement line. On the other side, Hannibal's center giving ground. Slowly, deliberately, not breaking, giving ground in a controlled way that pulled the Roman center forward. While the flanks moved, while the cavalry worked the wings. He had read the reports from Trebia. He had spoken to 3 men who survived Trasimene. The pattern was the same. He looked at the plain around Cannae. He looked at where the river ran behind where Rome would stand. He rolled the map back up. He left it on the table. He did not put it away. He was going to come back to it tonight. He already knew he was going to come back. Outside, Rome made its afternoon sounds. Iron on stone. The Tiber somewhere behind the buildings. the city that had just elected its consuls and was satisfied with what it had done. He was not satisfied. He was not yet afraid. He was somewhere between the two, something forming. He had not named it yet. He sat in his study in the afternoon light and let it take its time. He thought about what Fabius had not said. He thought about the silence in the garden, the silence that was an answer. He thought about the silence of a man who understood exactly what was going to happen, and had no authority left to prevent it. He sat with all of this. Then he got up. He went to find the scout who had made the note about the wind at Cannae. He wanted to hear the report again from the beginning. Chapter 4. What a careful man knows. The map was still open. It had been open since the army crossed into Apulia. 3 weeks. He had not rolled it at night. He had not rolled it in the morning. He had come back to it so many times it showed where his hands pressed at the edges. Not damage. Where? The wear of consultation. He stood in front of it in the late evening. The lamp was low. He did not increase it. He could see what he needed to see. He had memorized the map. He had memorized it the way he memorized ground he was going to be responsible for, until the marks were part of his thinking rather than information he had to consult. The plain around Cannae. The Aufidus River ran along the south and east. To the north, a low ridge too gradual to effect a formation. The town of Cannae on its small rise above the flat. And below the town, the plain going on. He had ridden to the eastern edge 2 days before. He had turned back to look west. The plain had extended in front of him longer than the eye could make useful. He had stood in it and understood something about the word flat that you could not understand from a report. You knew it from a report. You knew it differently when you were standing inside it. Flat meant there was nothing between you and wherever the cavalry came from. He had argued for the higher ground west of the river. Not an argument exactly. He did not argue with Varro. Arguing with Varro was counterproductive. The thing about Varro was not that he was unintelligent. He was intelligent. He had a particular kind of intelligence. The kind that processed information through a filter of what the information meant for the decision he had already made. He had made his decision at the forum in January. The decision was fight. He had not made a secondary decision about where and how. He had not needed to. He had made the primary decision, and everything that followed from it was details. He said to Paullus, "The plain is correct. The army is large enough to negate the plain's cavalry advantage." Paullus had said, "Hannibal has been fighting armies larger than his for 2 years. He has won each time. The size of the army has not been the decisive factor." Varro had said, "Those armies were not organized correctly." Paullus had looked at him. He had said, "Our army is organized correctly." They were sharing command on alternate days. This had been the arrangement since the consular year began. On his day he held the command. He made decisions. He moved the army where he believed it should be. On Varro's day he advised. He obeyed. He had accepted this arrangement. It was the legal arrangement. He could not construct a sufficient argument against it. He had spent 3 weeks trying to use his alternate days to establish positions Varro could not undo. This was slower than making a single good decision. It was also the only option available. On his day 2 weeks ago, he had moved the main camp to the west bank. The west bank was higher ground. The approach from the east was gradual. Cavalry moving from the east would have to come uphill. Uphill was not the Numidians' preferred angle. On Varro's day the following morning, Varro moved the camp back to the east bank. He said, "The east bank is closer to the supply road from Canusium." This was true. The supply road was closer. Paullus had considered saying, "The supply road is not why we are here." He had not said it. He had said, The east bank places the cavalry approach on flat ground in Hannibal's favor. Varro had said, 80,000 men do not need favorable cavalry approach. They need the supply road. He had accepted this. He stood in front of the map in the low lamplight. He put his finger on the plain near Cannae. He had a formation in his mind. He had been developing it for 2 weeks. 8 lines deep in the center. Depth over width. Slow the push, absorb Hannibal's flanks. He had drawn this for Varro 4 days ago and explained the reasoning point by point. Varro had listened. He had not disagreed with the reasoning. He had said, the formation is overly conservative. We have the numbers. The formation should reflect the numbers. He had said, Hannibal's center has never pushed through a deep Roman center. His advantage is his flanks. If we reduce our center to extend our flanks, we give him the match he has won twice already. Varro had said, we are 8 legions, not 4. He had accepted this also. He stood in front of the map. He pressed his finger on the plain near Cannae. He thought about what he could still do. Not many things. Tomorrow was Varro's day. The day after was his. He would use his day to compress the center as much as Varro had expanded it. He would use his day to place the cavalry on the wings in the most defensible configuration available. After that, the plain would do what the plain did. He had been doing this for 31 years, preparing for things he could not stop, doing what he could do, accepting the remainder. He was not done preparing. He was not going to be done preparing by morning, but morning was coming. The Aufidus River ran along the southern edge of the plain. Wide flat ground on both sides, open and mostly treeless. Low rises to the north too gradual to effect a formation. Nothing to slow a cavalry line. Nothing to break an infantry advance. The kind of terrain that rewarded the larger army completely. Room to spread. Room for every man to occupy his assigned width. This was the kind of terrain that appeared at first consideration to be ideal for Rome. He had done the first consideration in February. He had arrived at ideal. He had done the second consideration in March and in April and in 2 sessions last week. He had been arriving at the same place each time. The same place he had been arriving at since January, when he first heard the name Cannae from a scout. The place was not ideal. It was the opposite of ideal. He worked through the logic slowly. He had done this many times. He did it again because the careful repetition of the logic was the thing that kept him honest. When you wanted to believe something, you looked for the evidence that confirmed it. When you did not want to believe something, you looked for the evidence that refuted it. The repetition was the antidote. The repetition made you see the same facts each time. Rome would have the larger army. This was the assumption the planning rested on. Varro had said it in their first joint session. The numbers favor Rome. On open ground, numbers decide things. He had been studying Hannibal for more than a year, not from personal feeling, from the professional habit of understanding an adversary. He had read everything the scouts brought back. He had spoken to men who had been at Trebia. He had found 3 officers who survived the lake. He had asked them specific questions about the sequence of the action. The pattern was the same each time. At Trebia, Rome had the larger force. Hannibal chose the ground. He placed his army where he wanted the Roman army to come. The Roman army came. They crossed a cold river and found his formation waiting for them. They were destroyed. At the lake by Trasimene, Flaminius had his legions. Hannibal placed himself where the Roman march would lead. The road followed the lakeshore, the hills on one side, the lake on the other. The Roman army marched into that space. They were destroyed. Both times Rome had more men. Both times Hannibal selected the ground. Both times the Roman army came to the ground he had selected. Both times the same outcome. He was looking at the same sequence forming, the same logic, the same patient construction, place chosen, a reason offered to Rome to come to that place. Rome coming. He let the thought form fully that he had been keeping at a distance. Hannibal needed supplies. This was true. Taking the Roman depot at Cannae would help. 2 years of living off Italian farmland had limits. The grain would carry his army through the summer. But Hannibal had survived 2 Italian winters without a Roman depot. He was not starving. He had managed his supply situation through 2 full seasons without this particular grain. He did not need Cannae. He needed Rome to go to Cannae. Those were different things. The depot was not the prize. It was the invitation. He stood over the map for a long time. The lamp burned lower. He did not increase it. He could see what he needed to see. He needed to speak to Fabius. He went in the morning, early before the city was fully moving. The streets on the way to the Palatine were quiet. A cart driver heading south. A slave moving at the pace of early morning. The city had a different quality before the business of the day began. Less performance in it. Fabius's slave let him through without comment. The old man was in the garden. He was standing at the far end of the path between the winter plants, looking at them with the particular focused expression he wore when working through something he had not yet solved. Not a blank stare, active, as if the plants were relevant. He looked up when Paullus came through. They walked together. Paullus had learned, over many years in the Senate, how to walk alongside a thinking man. You matched the pace. You did not introduce a topic too quickly. You let the walking do part of the work. "Tell me what you see," Paullus said. At Cannae, Fabius kept walking. He was quiet, long enough that another man would have repeated the question. Paullus did not. He let the silence extend. It was doing something. Fabius stopped at the far end of the path. He looked at a dead plant near the wall. Small, cut back for winter. The bare structure of it. He looked at it the way he looked at everything he took seriously. Fully. Without shortening the time. Then he turned and walked back. He did not answer the question. Paullus understood. An answer would have meant saying it out loud, making it a formal position, a prediction attached to his name, available to be used against him later. Fabius had made predictions out loud before and had paid for them. He had learned. The silence was not evasion. The silence was the answer. Said, "Yes, I see what you see." Said, "I am not the consul." Said, "You are." They reached the gate. Fabius mentioned the spring planting, a vine that had not done well. Paullus responded appropriately. They parted with a nod. He walked back down the hill. He thought about what careful men knew. A careful man did not move until he understood the ground. He read the reports twice. He visited the terrain when he could. He modeled the outcomes and assigned them probabilities. He adjusted his approach as information changed. He was rarely surprised by things he had anticipated. This was what careful men were built for. And sometimes a careful man entered a situation the care could not fix. Not because he was not careful enough. Not because he missed a detail. Because the decision was already made by the men around him. Because they had the authority. Because the careful man was one voice in a command of 2. On alternating days, he thought about Varro. He thought about what Varro had said in their 3 planning sessions. The sessions had followed a pattern. Paullus presented a concern. Varro acknowledged it. He asked questions. The questions were not unintelligent. Varro was not an unintelligent man. He understood the information when it was presented to him. He did not change the plan. He had already decided. The planning sessions were not decisions. They were the form a decision took when a man wanted to appear to have considered alternatives. Paullus had sat through many of these sessions over 30 years. He knew the form. He knew the difference. A session where the outcome was uncertain. A session where the outcome was settled before it began. These were the second kind. Varro had listened. He had nodded. He had asked one question. Then he had moved to the next item. The plan had not changed. He went back to his study. He unrolled the map. He put his finger on the plain below Cannae. He marked where the Roman formation would stand. He marked where Hannibal's formation would stand. He marked the river. He marked the low ridge to the north. Then he stopped. There was a detail from a scout report 3 weeks ago. He had written it in the margin. He thought about it now. The wind on the Cannae plain in summer came from the south. Consistent and steady. The scouts had noted it because the horses were difficult in it. It crossed the open plain from south to north without interruption. Nothing to break it. If Rome formed facing north and west, using the river behind it, the wind would be in Roman faces. Dust and sun and wind. All of it arriving together from the south. Hannibal would form with the wind behind him. Paullus wrote this down. He had no use for it. He could not stand before Varro and say, "The wind is wrong." There was no room where this detail changed anything. He wrote it down anyway. He rolled the map back up. He did not put it away. He sat in his study. The house was quiet. He had done what he could do so far. There was more to do. It would all happen on the ground. The ground had already been chosen. He would be in the field soon. He would look at the plain from the inside. He would look at the river behind where Rome would stand. He would look at the wind. He would do all of this. Then he would do his job. Fight the battle that Varro had decided to fight. He would fight it as well as it could be fought. He would keep the cavalry tight to the left flank. He would argue for depth over width until Varro stopped listening. He would make the case for every adjustment that improved the odds by any amount. He would do all of this. He sat in the quiet study. He thought, a careful man can see exactly where he is going and not be able to stop going there. That is also something a careful man knows. He went back to the map the next morning. He went back to it every morning. This had been his practice for 3 months. He left it on the table at night and came back to it in the morning. Some mornings he did not look at it. He simply acknowledged that it was there. Some mornings he looked at it for a long time. This morning he looked at it for a long time. He put his finger on the town of Cannae. He held it there for a while. He moved it south to the river. He held it on the river. He thought about the calculation Hannibal had made. Not the tactical calculation, the strategic one. The calculation that preceded the tactics by months or years. The calculation that said, this is the ground, and this is the reason Rome will come to it. He thought about the grain depot, the reason Rome would come to it. 86,000 men for 30 days required a specific amount of grain. After 30 days, the army needed supply. The depot at Cannae was the closest adequate supply point in southern Apulia. The army would need to move toward it. Hannibal had known this. He had known it before the army left Rome. He had been living in southern Italy for 2 years. He knew the supply geography. He knew where the depots were. He knew that an army of this size, moving south in the summer, would need Cannae within 30 days. He had positioned himself accordingly. Not at Cannae, near it, visible from it, on ground that offered the invitation to a full engagement. Close enough that the Roman army would need to address him before it could secure the depot. Paullus looked at the map. He had a note in his kit about the wind. He had a note about the river transition zone. He had a note about the slope of the ground between the river and the plain. He had accumulated these notes over 3 months. He looked at each one in sequence. The wind from the south, the river behind the Roman position, the slope that directed momentum toward the Roman center from the flanks. He thought about each detail separately. Then he thought about them together. Separately, each detail was a fact about terrain. Together, they were the shape of an engagement. He had read the shape before. He had read it in the reports from Trebia, in the accounts from Trasimene, the specific shape of a battle that Hannibal had arranged in advance. The Roman army pressing the center giving ground in a controlled way, the flanks moving, the cavalry working the wings, the center surrounded. He was looking at the same shape in advance. He was the only man in the command who appeared to be looking at it. He rolled the map. He went to find Varro. He had an argument to make. He had made it before. He was going to make it again. Not because he expected the argument to succeed, because he had an obligation to make it. The obligation was separate from the outcome. He found Varro in the planning room with 3 tribunes. He made the argument. He said, "The center will be the trap." He said, "Depth over width." He said, "The cavalry must stay tight to the left flank." Varro listened. He said, "I understand the concern." He moved to the supply question. Paullus went back to his study. He sat with the map he had rolled. He thought, a careful man makes the argument. A careful man makes it clearly and at the right time and in the right room. He does not stop making it until there is no more time. After that, the ground has what the ground has. He unrolled the map. He looked at Cannae one more time. He had read the map 14 times in the past 3 months. He had a specific count because he had marked each reading in the margin. Not every reading left a mark. Only the readings where he found something new, something he had not noted before, a detail that arrived freshly on the 14th reading that had been there on the first. The detail was small. It was the relationship between the width of the plain and the depth of the proposed Roman formation. He had been calculating width. He had been calculating depth separately. He had not calculated the ratio. He calculated it now. The Roman formation at standard depth covered a specific proportion of the plain's width. Hannibal's formation was known from Trebia and Trasimene. Hannibal's formation covered a slightly larger proportion of the plain's width. The difference was the flanks. At standard depth, the Roman formation would not cover the full plain. The ends of the Roman line would be open ground, open to cavalry. He had said, depth over width. He had said it for a different reason. He had said it because deep formations absorbed pressure better than wide ones. The ratio argument was separate. He had the ratio now. He was going to bring it to the next planning session. He calculated the depth that would close the gap. He wrote it down. He was going to bring it to Varro. He already knew the answer. He had been in 12 planning sessions. He knew the answer. The answer was not going to change. The formation was not going to change. He was going to bring it anyway, because a careful man made the argument, because the record was the thing that remained. He went to find Fabius one more time, not for advice. He did not go for advice. He went because he had a question that was not about advice. He had a question about what it felt like. He found the old man in the same garden. He had a sense that Fabius spent most of his mornings in this garden now. The city was loud and the garden was quiet, and there was something here that required his attention. They walked. "I have the ratio," Paullus said. Fabius looked at him. "The formation depth required to close the width gap," Paullus said. "I have the number." Fabius kept walking. "I am going to bring it to Varro." "Yes," Fabius said. "He will not change the formation." "No," Fabius said. They walked for a while. "I went to the garden one more time," Paullus said. "I keep going back to the same things." Fabius stopped. He looked at the same dead plant he had looked at the last time. The bare structure of it. The way it held its shape through the winter without the thing that had made it what it was. He said nothing. Paullus waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned it not from training but from watching men who were better at it than he was. Fabius was better at it than he was. He had watched Fabius wait in Senate sessions. He had watched him wait in the garden. He waited the way good ground waited. Without urgency. Present. Fabius kept walking. He did not say anything else. They parted at the gate. Paullus walked back to his study. He unrolled the map. He put his finger on the width gap. He put his other finger on the depth required to close it. He held both places at once. He looked at what was between his fingers. That was what the battle was going to be. That space between his two fingers. He rolled the map back up. He left it on the table. He did not sleep well that night. He rarely slept well before significant things. This was not fear. He had examined this over many years and concluded it was not fear. Fear produced a specific sleep. A sleep that was too light. A sleep that surfaced frequently and returned each time to the same thought. He knew what that sleep felt like. He had had it before engagements that he had been genuinely uncertain about. This was different. This was the sleep of a man who had done everything he could do, who knew it was not enough, who could do nothing further until morning. He lay in the dark and thought about the map. He had been thinking about the map for 4 months. He knew it the way he knew the terrain of his family's estate in Campania. Not from memory but from presence. The way you knew a place you had spent time in. The marks and the distances had become part of how he thought about the south. He thought about the center. The Roman formation at standard depth placed the center at a specific depth. He had argued for 8 lines. Varro had said 6. They had settled through the planning sessions on 6. 6 was not 8. 6 lines deep absorbed pressure differently from 8. He knew the numbers. He had done the calculation. 6 lines deep would hold for a specific amount of time. After that time, the center would give ground. Not collapse. Give ground. A managed retreat. The kind that looked like progress from outside. He had seen this before. In the reports from Trebia, the Roman center had initially pushed forward. The officers on the line had sent back positive reports. The enemy center was giving ground. The advance was proceeding. The advance had been a mechanism. The center gave ground. The flanks closed. The formation compressed from the outside while it was still moving forward on the inside. By the time the inside understood what the outside was doing, the outside was already there. This was what 6 lines deep produced. He thought about 8 lines deep. 8 lines deep moved more slowly, moved less decisively, looked less impressive from outside. A Senate report on the engagement would not describe an 8-line deep formation with enthusiasm. It was not the kind of formation that produced dramatic positive reports from the line officers. It was the kind of formation that stayed intact when the flanks closed. He lay in the dark. He thought, I have said this. I have said it 6 times. Tomorrow I will say it 1 more time. Varro will hear it. The formation will be 6 lines deep. He thought about what 6 lines deep meant for tomorrow. He thought about Marcus Attilius in the 4th tent. He thought about the names he knew. He thought about the count of men in the formation, the number of lines, the time before the outside pressure reached them. He thought, some of them will have time, not all. He did not think further than this. He got up before the watch change. He dressed himself. He went to the map. Chapter 5. South toward the plain. 8 legions moved south in late spring. Rome had not put 8 legions in one place before. 4 legions was the standard consular force. 2 for each consul. For was what Rome sent to wars it expected to win. For was what had crossed the Alps at the start of the First Punic War. For was what had ended the First War with Carthage. 8 was something else. 8 was what Rome assembled when it had decided to end a thing. Paullus watched the army move south for 3 days. He watched from the elevated road north of Venusia. The column stretched further than the eye could resolve into individual men. From that distance the column was not men. It was a sound and a color, the sound of iron on stone, carrying in the morning air, the color of dust rising from the Apulian road in June. He had traveled this road once before as a young officer, going north to Brundisium for a posting in the east. He had been 23. The road had been the same road. The country on both sides had looked the same. The sky above it had been the same. He thought about what was different now. What was different now was the column behind him. He pressed his hands flat on his saddle and rode south. Varro spoke to the army on the evening of the 4th day. He was good at this. His voice carried without apparent effort. He stood on the raised ground south of the camp. He spoke to 80,000 men without seeming aware of the number. He told them what they were. He told them what they had. He told them what would happen when they met Hannibal's army in the open. He said, "We have been patient long enough. We have watched our land burn long enough. We have waited on ridges long enough. We are going to the plain. We are going to face him in the open. We are going to break him in the open." That is what 8 Roman legions do to 50,000 Carthaginians. The army responded. Paullus stood at the edge of it and did not respond. He was listening to the sound the army made, not the words, the sound underneath the words, the particular frequency of 80,000 men who had decided something. He thought, "They have decided." He thought, "The deciding has already happened." He went to his tent. He went to the map. The night before Cannae, he was awake before the first watch change. The fire outside his tent had burned to nothing. No one had come to tend it. The camp was still, not silent. A camp this large was never silent. But there was a particular quiet beneath the ordinary sounds. The quiet of tens of thousands of men who had gone to sleep knowing what tomorrow was. He lay still and listened to it. Horses, the ofidus somewhere to the south, the creak of the tent frame leather when the temperature dropped, a man coughing far down the line, the ordinary sounds an army made when it was breathing. He knew this sound. He had been listening to it for 30 years. He got up. He dressed himself. He had been dressing himself since before he was an officer. The same sequence at 53 as at 19. He went to the map. The plain around Cannae, the ofidus running along the south. To the north, the low ridge, the town of Cannae on its rise, the flat below. He had memorized it. He could close his eyes and see it. He opened his eyes. He put his finger on the plain near Cannae. He held it there. He had walked part of it 2 days before. He had ridden to the eastern edge and turned back to look west. The plain had extended in front of him longer than the eye could make useful. He had stood in it and understood something about the word flat that you could not understand from a report. He looked at the formation he had proposed. 8 lines deep in the center, depth over width. Slow the push, absorb Hannibal's flanks instead of exposing them. Varro had extended the front. He had argued. He had used his alternate days to compress what he could. He had placed the cavalry where he could place it. He had done what he could. He thought about the men he had walked through this afternoon. He had gone through the camp at the 7th hour, not to inspect. He had officers for that. He had gone to look at the men, to learn the names of the century captains, to understand what the army was going to be tomorrow on the ground in the formation. He had walked through 17 centuries. He had learned 17 names. He would not remember all of them tomorrow. He would remember some. In the fourth tent, a man named Marcus Attilius was adjusting his shoulder plate. It had been badly seated since Venusia. He had been adjusting it for 5 days. He was going to adjust it one more time tomorrow morning, and it was not going to be different. He had not told Attilius this. He had asked the sentry captain about the man. The sentry captain had said, "Solid. 8 years in." He held the line. He had nodded. He had walked on. He wrote 3 things down before he went back to sleep. He had been keeping notes since Trasimene. Not orders. Not reports. Notes. Observations. The kind of small things that might matter later if there was a later. He wrote, "Wind from the southeast this evening. Check direction at first light. If wind holds from southeast, it will be in the Roman center's faces." He wrote, "4th century from the left in the 2nd Italian Legion has a gap in the rear rank. 3 men transferred to the hospital in the past 2 days. Gap has not been filled. Fill before first formation." He wrote, "The office is running low. Men filling from the South Bend will have to go further than yesterday." He folded the notes. He placed them under the map case. He thought about who he was writing the notes for. He was not sure there would be someone to give them to. He was not sure he would be present to give them. He wrote them anyway. He went back to the map one last time. He stood in front of it. He held it for a moment without opening it. He had read it 14 times. He had memorized it. He did not need to open it. He opened it anyway. He put his finger on the plain near Cannae. He thought about the width, the depth, the wind, the river. He thought about everything he had noted, everything he had written down, everything he had said in 11 planning sessions. He thought about Marcus Attilius adjusting his shoulder plate. He thought about Fabius in the garden. He rolled the map. He put it down. He lay down. He slept. The march through Samnium took 11 days. An early spring had dried the soil faster than the season usually allowed. The columns raised dust that could be seen from the ridgelines above the road. The men drank more water than the calculation had allowed. The calculation was adjusted. 3 mules died on the 5th day when the road climbed. Nobody died of thirst. But the adjustment cost time and a small amount of confidence. Soldiers felt adjustments. The road through Samnium was old. It had been used by armies before this one. The surface was good where the legions had maintained it. Worn at the edges where carts had cut into the soft shoulder. He rode behind the column on Varro's days and looked at the surface. He could read a road the way he read a map. The history of previous armies was in the road if you knew how to look. He looked. He counted the maintenance intervals. He noted the sections where water drainage was poor and the road had been cut deeply by the spring rains. He noted the section where an old bridge had been widened and the widening was recent, not old legionary work. He noted the ford on the 5th day. The current was stronger than the scouts had reported. The crossing cost 2 hours. He wrote all of this down. He had been doing this for 30 years. Most observations never became useful. This was not the reason you made them. You made them because the habit of observation was itself the point. A man who observed everything would eventually have what he needed. A man who observed selectively would eventually find that the thing he did not observe was the thing that mattered. He was learning the army. He was going to need to know it well. Paullus rode at the front on his command days. On Varro's days he rode at the back of the column. He had agreed to this in their first planning session. He had calculated what opposing it would cost. The cost was too high. He was spending his disagreements carefully. The back of the column was not nothing. He watched the units hold their formations over 12 miles of road. He counted the intervals between centuries. He noted which tribunes maintained the spacing and which let it drift. He watched the cavalry officers manage their horses in the heat. He noted which ones worked with the animals and which ones worked against them. He watched the supply train and counted the gaps between wagons. He was learning which officers could be trusted with independent judgment. He was going to need to know this. Varro was not a bad commander in the simple meaning of that phrase. He made decisions and communicated them with clarity. He visited the units and knew which officers to trust with straightforward tasks. He had a quality that could not be trained. He could speak to tired men at the end of a long march. He could make them believe the situation was manageable. His voice carried a sureness that men responded to. If the war had required a different thing, he might have been adequate to it. The war was asking for something specific. It was asking for a man who looked at a flat plain and immediately understood whose advantage it served. On the 8th day, scouts found the enemy screen. It was Varro's day. Word came back along the column fast. A rider first, then a second, then an officer at a gallop. Paullus was near the rear when the second rider passed him. He turned his horse and went forward, technically outside the protocol of the alternating command. He went anyway. He came up the ridge and found Varro there with his 3 senior officers. The valley below was wide and open, ground slightly uneven in the way flat land often was. A line of low scrub along the eastern edge. Hannibal's cavalry screen was visible to the south and east. Numidian horsemen, light cavalry, experienced and fast. They were moving at a steady canter in a wide, patient pattern. Not retreating, not advancing, the motion of water in a wide channel. He had seen Numidian cavalry operate for 8 months from a ridge above Campania. He knew what this pattern meant. "We go down," Varro said. Paullus looked at the valley. "The valley narrows past that scrub line to the east," he said. He says, "We cannot use our numbers in a narrow space." Paullus says, "We have 4 times their count on this ridge." He says, "Not in the narrows. We match them evenly in the narrows." He watched the screen complete another slow circle. "They are showing us where they want us to go." Varro turned to look at him. The look had a quality Paullus had seen before. The look of a man who has heard something and set it aside. Not hostile. Something more settled than hostility. A decided man. "Tomorrow is your day," Varro said. He meant, "Today is mine." He turned back to the valley and sent the cavalry down. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. Hannibal's screen absorbed the first contact and gave ground in an orderly way, pulling back south. The Roman cavalry pressed. The screen gave, then it broke and ran. The Roman cavalry took the valley and filed their reports. 11 dead. 1 position gained. Varro declared it a success. Paullus watched from the ridge. He had been watching from the ridge. He had not gone down. There was nothing for him to do down there that the cavalry officers could not do themselves. He had stayed on the ridge and watched the pattern. The screen had absorbed the contact. It had given ground in an orderly way. It had broken at the right moment. Not too soon and not too late. Controlled. Precise. He looked at the valley where the Roman cavalry was standing in the ground it had taken. The ground they had been led to. He thought, "This is what it looks like from the outside. This is what Trebia looked like from the outside on the afternoon before Trebia. A successful engagement. Position gained. Confidence in the army's ability to close and press." He rode back down to the camp. That evening he spread the map on the command table. "Tell me again," he said to the lead scout. "Where was the screen when you first made contact?" The scout showed him. He put his finger on the place. He moved it slowly along the route the cavalry had followed. He marked where the valley narrowed. He marked where the screen had first been seen. He looked at the 2 marks. The screen had appeared at exactly the right point. The point that led the Roman cavalry into the wide section, before the narrows. The Roman cavalry had pressed forward through the wide section. The screen had broken off before the ground got worse, before numbers stopped mattering. He had given Rome a position. He had chosen which position to give. Paullus rolled the map. He said nothing to Varro that evening. He thought about what he had already said. He had said, "The center will be the trap, not the breakthrough." He had said, "Hannibal will let the center give ground because giving ground is the mechanism." He had said, "We need depth over width." He had said, "Keep the cavalry tight to the left flank. Whatever else happens, keep them tight." He had said all of it clearly. He had said it at the right time and in the right room. The plan had not changed. He stood outside his tent afterward and looked south. The land was already different from Samnium. Lower, more open. The sky held more room. The hills were farther apart and flatter on their tops. He could not see the plain from here. He could feel the ground preparing for it. Tomorrow was his day. He would take the column south. He would look at the ground he could not change. He went back into the tent. He sat with the rolled map. He did not unroll it. He already knew what it said. He thought about what Fabius had said in the garden, about the flat plain. From both sides of the formation, he thought, "I know both sides." He thought about the side Rome would be on. He had looked at the river behind where Rome would stand. He had noted the wind. He had noted the slope of the plain and the position of the morning sun. He had noted everything that a careful man noted. Hannibal had noted the same things. The difference was that Hannibal had chosen this. Rome had been invited. The plain below Cannae was 3 miles wide. The river was behind where Rome would stand. The wind came from the south. He had been patient for 2 full years. He was almost finished being patient. He had walked the plain on his command day. He had taken a small escort and ridden south. He had left the column and gone to the flat ground. He had ridden across it from east to west. He had turned and ridden back. He had stopped 3 times and dismounted. He pressed the soil with his hand. Dry, firm, the kind of soil that received a formation without giving under it. This was relevant. A formation that sank into soft ground moved slowly and held its shape poorly. A formation on firm soil moved at full speed and maintained its intervals. This was good ground for a large, engaged formation. It was good for both formations. He remounted and rode to the north end of the plain. He turned and looked south toward the river. The plain extended before him. He counted his paces in his head. He estimated the width. He estimated the depth. He thought about how many men fit in this width in the standard formation at standard intervals. He arrived at a number. He arrived at the same number he had arrived at from the map. The map was accurate. He thought about what the map could not tell him. He looked at the wind. It was coming from the south. Consistent. He held his hand up. He felt it on his palm. He tilted his face into it. Dust and warmth and the smell of the river somewhere behind him. He would be facing this wind tomorrow. If Varro positioned the formation the way he had planned. He turned his horse and looked north. The low ridge to the north. The hills behind it. The approach route the army would come from. He stood on the plain and looked at both directions. He thought about Hannibal standing on this same plain, looking at both directions, choosing where Rome would stand, choosing before Rome knew where it was going. He rode back to the column. He went to Varro that evening. He made the argument one more time. He said, "The formation center needs to be deeper. 8 lines minimum." He said, "The cavalry must stay on the left flank." He said, "If the center starts moving too fast, the flanks will close before we can respond." He said, "This is the last time I will make this argument. After today there will not be a planning session to make it in." Varro listened to all of it. He was a man who listened well. He took in information with the posture of a man who found it useful. He asked questions. The questions were about logistics, supply lines, formation widths, cavalry numbers on the left flank. The questions were not about the tactical logic. He had already decided. Paullus had known this since the first planning session. He had made the argument anyway. He had made it at each planning session. He had made it 11 times. He had counted. 11 times. He could not make it a 12th. There was no 12th session. Tomorrow was Varro's day. He left the planning room. He went to the 4th tent in the 3rd century of the 2nd cohort. The man there was named Marcus Attilius. He had known this man's name since the 3rd day of the march. He had learned it not from a list, from an officer who had mentioned him during a maintenance question. The officer had said, "Attilius will know." He had filed the name. He stood outside the tent. The man was inside. He could hear him, the particular sound of a man preparing his kit for the night. Paullus moved on. He could not tell Marcus Attilius what tomorrow would ask of him. He could not tell any of them. He could only walk through the camp. He could only know the names. He walked through the camp. He knew many names. He thought about what Fabius had said in the garden, about the flat plain, from both sides of the formation. He thought about the side Paullus would be on. He thought about the side that had chosen the ground. He sat with the rolled map and listened to the camp settle into the night around him. The sounds of 86,000 men preparing for sleep. The horses, the fires going down, the century captains making their last rounds. He thought, "I have done what I could do. I have said what I could say. I have walked the ground. I have read the ground. I have made the argument 11 times. Tomorrow is Varro's day." He pressed his hands flat against the map. Somewhere out on that plain, Hannibal was counting. He had been counting since the day he entered Italy. Not the count of days. The count toward something specific. Something prepared. Something decided. The plain below Cannae was 3 miles wide. The river was behind where Rome would stand. The wind came from the south. He had been patient for 2 full years. He was almost finished being patient. Far to the south, on the plain below Cannae, Hannibal stood outside his tent. He had been standing there for an hour. He did this sometimes. Not often. On the evenings before significant things. He stood and looked at whatever there was to look at. Tonight there was the plain and the river and the stars and the camp behind him. He had been in Italy for 2 years and 3 months. He counted this the way he counted most things. Precisely. He had crossed the Ebro on a specific morning in the spring of the year he was 29. He had arrived at the Trebia River in November. He had won there. He had won at the lake in June of the following year. He had burned the Falernus in August. He had escaped the Casilinum defile in September. He had been doing this since before he was 20. Counting. The counting kept things real. A fact that was counted was a fact that was known. A fact that was merely believed was susceptible to adjustment. He did not want to adjust facts. He wanted to count them. He had counted the Romans. Not today's count. The count across 2 years. The Romans he had met at Trebia, Trasimene, in the engagements he had forced, in the ones he had avoided. He had a number. The number was accurate within a reasonable margin. He was not deceiving himself about the margin. He never deceived himself about margins. The Romans would send approximately 86,000 men to Cannae. He had 80,000 available. The difference was not the problem. He had fought successfully with inferior numbers before. He had designed the plan specifically to neutralize the number difference. The plan was not about numbers. It was about time. Time and the shape of the ground. He looked at the ground. He had been looking at this ground for 4 months. He had walked every part of it. Not once, multiple times. He had walked the south bank of the Aufidus. He had walked the plain from east to west. He had walked it north to south. He had walked the approach routes from the north, where the Roman army would come. He had stood at the point where the Roman formation would anchor on the river. He had counted his steps. He had noted the wind. He had noted the dust behavior when the ground was dry and the wind was from the south. He had noted the sight lines across the full width of the plain. He had noted where the dust would be thickest, where the morning sun would be in the eyes of the Roman line. He had noted all of this and incorporated it into the plan. The plan was complete. It had been complete for 3 months. He had not changed it since completing it. He had been waiting. Waiting was the part that required the most from him. Not because he was impatient. He was not impatient. He had been patient for 2 years. He could be patient for another month. The waiting was hard for a different reason. When the plan was complete and you were waiting for the moment to use it, you lived with the plan. Every day, you saw every variation. Every way it could go differently from what you expected. Everything you had not accounted for. There were always things you had not accounted for. He had not accounted for Fabius correctly the first time. He had accounted for him better after Casilinum. He had accounted for him at the hill in September. He had nearly had it that time. He had accounted for everything except the speed of the response. The speed of the response was Fabius. Fabius was no longer the consul. Varro and Paullus were the consuls. He had been watching both of them. He had received reports. Varro he understood. He had seen men like Varro before. In Iberia. In his father's campaigns. The man who gave the crowd what it wanted and was given command in exchange. He understood how that man fought. He fought toward the enemy center. He pushed until something broke. He believed in numbers. On flat ground with enough numbers, he was probably right about most things. This was not most things. Paullus he was less certain about. The reports described a man who walked terrain, who asked questions twice, who argued in planning sessions about formation depth, who had been outvoted 11 times and was still making the argument. He had a name in his mind for this kind of man. Not the Roman word, a Carthaginian word. The word meant, the man who sees clearly and cannot stop what he sees. He pressed his left thumb against his right knuckle. He thought about Paullus. He thought, tomorrow is Varro's day. After tomorrow it will not matter. He looked at the plain. He looked at the river. He looked at the width of the plain, the position of his formation, the position where the Roman formation would stand. He had been counting toward this for 2 years. He was at the end of the count. He went back inside. He had a few more things to prepare before morning. He dressed himself. He had been dressing himself since before he was an officer. Sandals, leg wrappings, tunic. The same sequence at 53 as at 19. He had never stopped doing it himself. He did not know entirely why. Something from the earliest soldiering, perhaps. The idea that a man should be able to prepare himself in the dark. That this much, at least, should remain unambiguous. He went to the map, still open on the field table. He had not rolled it up in this camp. Every night he came back to it. Every night he looked for the thing that made the situation different from what he feared it was. He came back now in the dark before dawn one final time. The lamp was very low. He did not increase it. He could see what he needed to see. He had memorized the map. He had memorized it the way he memorized ground he was going to be responsible for, until the marks were part of his thinking rather than information he had to consult. The plain around Cannae was 3 miles wide at its broadest. The Aufidus River ran along the south and east. To the north, a low ridge too gradual to effect a formation. The town of Cannae on its small rise above the flat. And below the town, the plain going on, wide and open and patient. The ground where 86,000 men would stand in a few hours. He had walked part of it 2 days before. He had ridden to the eastern edge and turned back to look west. The plain had extended in front of him longer than the eye could make useful. He had stood in it and understood something about the word flat that you could not understand from a report. You knew it from a report. You knew it differently when you were standing inside it. It was the kind of flat that gave a man no choices except the ones he had already made. He looked at the formation he had proposed. 8 lines deep in the center. Depth over width. Slow the push, absorb Hannibal's flanks instead of exposing them. He had drawn this for Varro 4 days ago. He had explained the reasoning point by point. He had said, if the center is 8 lines deep, it cannot be pushed through quickly. He had said, Hannibal's flanks will try to close. If the center is moving fast, they will close on empty space. The center needed to be slow. The center needed to be deep. Varro had said the formation was too conservative. He had said it pleasantly. The tone of a man setting something aside rather than contesting it. A man who had already decided. Paullus had said, the center will be the trap, not the breakthrough. He had said, Hannibal will let the center give ground. He had said, keep the cavalry tight to the left flank. Whatever else happens, keep them tight. Varro had nodded. The plan had not changed. Paullus rolled the map. He held it in both hands for a moment. He had not done this in this camp. He had left it open every night because he kept looking, kept adjusting, kept searching for the thing that made the situation different from what he feared it was. He had not found the thing. He had stopped believing he would find it. He put the map down. He thought about the map. He had spent 30 years of his life in front of maps. He had learned to read terrain from maps before he could read it from the ground. Then he learned to read it from the ground. Then he came back to the map to confirm what the ground had said. The 2 readings together were better than either one alone. He had read this map many times. He had walked the ground. The 2 readings agreed. He had hoped they would disagree. He had hoped the ground would tell him something the map had missed. Something that changed the shape of what was going to happen. The ground had told him the same things the map told him. Tomorrow was Varro's day. He stepped outside. Cold air. The camp in rows around him. Fires gone to coals. The Aufidus somewhere to the south. Audible now in the quiet. The sky was the color before dawn. The specific gray of a thing that had not yet decided. He looked out at the plain. Visible now. The darkness thinning enough that the flat ground showed below the sky. Going south toward the river. He breathed in. Cold air. Dry grass. The smell of 10,000 fires gone out. The residue of smoke and ash. The presence of an army that had marked the ground over several days. He thought about the morning he had led Fabius's horse to the stable. He did not know why it came to him now. He had not thought of it in weeks. He was standing at the edge of the Cannae plain before dawn. The image arrived with the clarity of things remembered at the wrong time. The cold passage on the side of the house. The tired animal. The brush on the peg. Nobody had asked him. Nobody had seen. He had been the consul-elect of Rome. Standing in a stable in January. It was the last morning he had been certain of something small. Since then, everything had been large. He stood in the cold air and held the memory for a moment. He did not analyze it. He did not look for what it meant. Some things arrived at unusual moments because the mind reached for something clear when everything else was not. The stable had been clear. The horse had needed attention. He had given it, simple and complete. Since then, nothing had been simple. He had served Rome for 31 years. He had not served it perfectly. He had been too slow twice. He had been too fast once. He had argued for positions he later revised. He had lived with all of it the way you lived with things that could not be undone. You thought about them. Then you thought about what came next. There was always something next. The sky was changing. A line of lighter gray along the eastern ridge. The day beginning whether anything was ready for it or not. He turned back toward the camp. Things still to do before Varro took authority at dawn. Units to check. Commands to pass. He would do all of it. He would do it in the time that was left. He walked through the tent rows. Men beginning to stir. Some outside their tents, looking at the sky or the plain or nothing particular. The way soldiers stood before a day they could not directly address. He passed the fourth tent. The man there was named Marcus Attilius. He had served in the northern campaigns 3 years before. He had a habit of adjusting his left shoulder plate before a march. He was doing it now. He had a scar on his left hand from a training accident, not a battle. He had never corrected anyone who assumed otherwise. Paullus knew. He had never said so. He walked on. He walked the full length of the camp. This had been his practice on the nights before significant actions. He had done it before his first engagement in the east. He had done it in Illyria and in the northern campaigns. He did not do it to inspect. He did it because the act of walking through the camp was itself the preparation. A camp at night before an action had a quality. A specific quality. He had been trying to name it for 30 years. He had not found the right word in Latin or Greek. It was not silence. The camp was not silent. It was not fear. Fear had a different texture. It was something between attention and acceptance. The men who were awake had that quality. The men who were asleep had that quality. Even the sleep before a significant action was different from ordinary sleep. He walked through it. He knew names in this camp. He had been learning them since the first day of the march. He had learned them the way he learned terrain. Not systematically, by presence and observation. When you paid attention to an army, names came to you. A century captain referred to a man by name when explaining a formation choice. A supply officer mentioned a man's skill at managing loads. An adjutant described an incident involving a specific soldier and the name attached itself. He had the names of approximately 300 men in this army. Not enough. The army was 86,000. He could not learn all of them. He had never been able to learn all of them in any command. He had always been able to learn some. He had always believed that the ones he knew stood differently when he walked past. Not because they were special. Because a man seen by his commander was a different kind of soldier than a man not seen. He walked past the sentry near the command tent. The one he had identified in the first week. The formation that held its intervals best over 12 miles of road. He noted the fire. Low but still present. One man tending it with the easy economy of someone who had done this many times. He noted the man's name. He had it from a list. He kept walking. The plain was more visible now. He had been walking for 40 minutes. The sky had passed from black to gray. He could see the ground extending south. The particular gray of early morning, not quite light, not quite dark. The in-between time. He had stood in many in-between times. He thought about what came next. Not the tactics. He had run through the tactics many times. He could think about them without producing new information. What came after the tactics was what he thought about now. He thought about Rome. Rome would receive a report. He did not know what the report would say. He did not know the outcome. A careful man who saw the shape of an engagement in advance was not a man who knew the outcome. He had seen the shape of Trebia in advance, from descriptions and reports. He had not been at Trebia. He had seen the shape of Trasimene in advance, from the same sources. He had not been at Trasimene. He was going to be at Cannae. He thought about what Rome would do with the report. Rome would receive it the way Rome received bad news. In public, formally, with the discipline of an institution that had survived bad news before. Then the private accounting. The Senate would review the command decisions. The surviving officers would give their accounts. The accounts would be heard in the specific way the Senate heard accounts. Looking for the decision that could have been different. Looking for the man who could have done otherwise. He had been in rooms where these accountings happened. He had given accounts. He had heard accounts. He had watched the Senate work through the process of deciding who to hold responsible. The process was not always accurate. It was not designed to be accurate. It was designed to produce a clear conclusion. The institution needed clear conclusions. Clear conclusions allowed the institution to proceed. He thought about what his account would be. He had said, "The center will be the trap." He had said, "Depth over width." He had said, "Keep the cavalry tight." He had said all of it in the right room at the right time. He had the planning notes. He had the documentation of 11 sessions. Whatever happened on the plain tomorrow, he had the documentation. He thought, "This is what I am reduced to. The record." He kept walking. He came to the edge of the camp, the last row of tents, then open ground, then the plain going south. He stood at the edge. He had been at this position twice before in this campaign. Once when the army first arrived. He had stood at the edge and looked at the plain for a long time. The second time 3 days ago when he had walked the plain himself. He had stood at this same edge and looked back at the camp behind him. He was standing at the edge now. The plain was quiet. In the gray light before dawn, he could see approximately a mile. After a mile the light failed. He could not see the river. He could not see where Hannibal's camp was. He could hear the Aufidus somewhere to the south. The particular sound of a wide river in the early morning. Not loud, present. He thought about the river. The river was behind where Rome would stand. This was Varro's decision. He had argued against it. He had said, "The river removes the retreat option." He had said, "A formation without a retreat option will be pressed differently than a formation with one." Varro had said, "The river prevents flanking from the rear." They had argued about this in session 4. He had lost the argument. He stood at the edge of the camp and looked at the dark plain. He thought about what a man did when he had lost 11 arguments about a battle he was about to fight. He had an answer. He fought the battle. He fought it as well as it could be fought, given the ground chosen, given the formation decided, given the plan that would not change. He made every adjustment within the plan that was available to him. He kept the cavalry tight to the left flank until the last possible moment. He argued for depth in the center every time Varro was willing to hear the argument. He positioned the best units where the pressure would be highest. He did everything that was within his authority to do. He went where the battle went. This was what he had been telling himself for 3 months. He had believed it. He still believed it. He had also believed it about men who had died at Trebia and at the lake. He had believed it about Flaminius. He had believed it about the officers who had served correctly and arrived at outcomes they could not prevent. He stood at the edge of the camp. The sky was lighter. The plain was more visible, wide and flat and very patient. The way the ground was always patient with the things that happened on it. The ground did not remember what year it was. The wind was coming from the south. He had written that down 3 weeks ago. He had the note somewhere in his kit. He had written it thinking he would find a use for it. He had not found a use for it. The wind was there anyway. He had done what he could do. He had said what he could say. He had read the map until reading it further served no purpose. He had been, across this whole campaign, what he was: careful man. A man who read the terrain, who learned the names of the soldiers in the fourth tent, who counted the exits before he entered a room, who said the uncomfortable thing in the right room at the right time, who did not stop saying it until there was no more time. Sometimes that was not enough. He had known men in his life for whom it was never enough. Men who did everything correctly and still arrived at outcomes they could not prevent. He had never thought he would be one of them. He thought about it now. That was also something a careful man knew. He walked on. He came back to the gate of the camp. He had walked the full perimeter. Not quickly, slowly. He had noted each unit's position. He had checked the sentries. He had stopped at 3 places. The fires had gone completely out. The men on watch were using the dark. He had not spoken to any of them. He had looked. He had noted. He had moved on. This was the other side of what he was. The side that worked while the other man slept. The side that did the maintenance work of being careful. Not the dramatic side. The arguments, the maps, the record. This side. The walking in the dark. The noting of which sentries were using the dark. The 3 fires that had gone out. He would leave notes for the sentry captains. He would leave them before Varro took authority. The captains would read the notes. They would address the issues. The issues were small. 3 fires. 3 positions in the dark. Small things in the context of 86,000 men before Cannae. He had learned that small things were where the work was. The large things took care of themselves or they did not. You could not control the large things. You controlled the small ones. 3 fires. 3 positions. Notes for the sentry captains. He went to his tent. He sat at the desk. He thought about Fabius in the garden. About the silence. About what the silence said. About the man who had done the same work across a different 6 months. Who had come home to an empty gate. He thought, what is the shape of a man who does the work and arrives at an outcome he could not prevent? He had thought about this before, not in these terms, in the specific terms of specific men he had known, officers who had served correctly and been defeated, magistrates who had made the correct decisions and been outvoted, men who had done what the situation required and found that the situation required something they could not give. He had thought about each of them separately. He was thinking about them together now. The shape was the same. A man who kept doing the work after the outcome was clear. Who wrote down the wind at Cannae. Who left notes for the sentry captains about 3 fires that had gone out. Who said the argument one more time. Not because the argument would change anything. Because the argument was what was required. He had been doing this for 31 years. He was going to do it tomorrow. On Varro's day, he pressed his hands flat on the desk. He thought, tomorrow is what tomorrow is. I have done what I could do. I will do what tomorrow allows. He went to the map one last time. He stood in front of it. He held it for a moment without opening it. He had read it 14 times. He had memorized it. He could close his eyes and see the plain and the river and the positions. He did not need to open it. He was going to open it anyway. He unrolled it. He put his finger on the plain below Cannae. He held it there. He thought about the width and the depth and the wind and the river. He thought about everything he had noted, everything he had written down, everything he had said in 11 planning sessions. He thought about Marcus Attilius in the 4th tent adjusting his shoulder plate. He thought about Fabius in the garden. He rolled the map. He put it down. He lay down. He slept. Writer's note: I do not read Varro as a fool. He was the man Rome chose, not despite the forum but because of it. He told them what they needed to hear in January and they gave him the command in June. I watch Paullus write down the wind direction. I watch him note the gap in the rear rank of the 4th century. I watch him roll the map and lie down. He said everything he could say in the right room at the right time. The plan did not change. I think about what it costs to see clearly, to act on what you see, to arrive anyway at a morning that was decided before you woke. He did not stop. He walked through the camp. He learned the names. He wrote down the wind. That is the full extent of what was possible. Next time, Cannae. The plain is flat. There is nowhere to go.